Chapter 421, Gatherings. The last few notes of the song drifted on the air until it stopped. After a moment, polite applause replaced the music. The would-be bard lowered his instrument, some kind of harp, and bowed. Regina put down the cup she'd been nursing and joined the applause. So far, this cultural evening has been a resounding success, she mused. It was billed as an informal occasion. Many of her drones present in the capital who weren't otherwise busy were here, though they were still outnumbered by courtiers and officials and their family members. Still, they'd managed to keep the guest list short and exclusive enough that all of them fit in a large parlor without it feeling crowded. Everyone who participated was actually present and part of the gathering, which meant some notable artists and musicians were mixed in with the boring crowd, and it also meant that local nobles, and a few drones, tried to present their own offerings, too. They varied in quality. Still, it was interesting. So far, they seemed to have settled on a mix of traditional Cernlian or Nerlian songs or poetry, some new ones from the last few years, and a few attempts at revivals of really old ones from before the Cataclysm. Too many pieces still seemed calculated to flatter Regina, to praise her reign or exalt the imperial throne, but she supposed she couldn't complain too much about that. There were at least as many genuinely interesting contributions, and sometimes they did overlap, of course. The latest musician departed the stage and another young man hopped onto it. Regina raised an eyebrow. Daniel was one of her students, a more recent find but surprisingly talented, and originally from a knightly family. He was wearing an artistic outfit today, with stripes in several colors that somehow didn't clash, a necklace with large feathers, and a half cape. "Ladies and gentlemen." He bowed. "First, I would like to thank Lady Galatea for this opportunity. I must admit I pestered her somewhat until she gave me the help I wanted, so I could perform for you today, and especially for Her Imperial Majesty. She must miss the tones and stories of her homeland terribly, and I thought I might go some very small way in alleviating this lack. Please forgive any mistakes or mangling, as while I've tried to learn, I do not truly speak the language." Regina leaned forward in interest. Daniel was only the second person today to choose another language than global. He cleared his throat and began. "Hat alti hexenmeister sich doch einmal wegbegen. /UND nun soll sing geister /auch nach meinem Willen leben." Regina blinked despite herself, then smiled. The room had fallen silent, and she focused on the words. His accent was clearly noticeable, but it was also evident he'd made an effort to get the pronunciation correct, so it was at least understandable. It still sounded a bit funny to her, but she tried to ignore that. Wall /Monch Streck, he continued, gesturing expansively, and she had to stop herself from grinning. People were obviously looking at her, a few had even twitched slightly. She just focused on following the ballad. It wasn't the longest she knew, presumably read in school, though not that short either. Finally, the apprentice he voiced called for the master, still with dramatic intonation, and Daniel switched his voice to a deeper one, ending the ballad with a flourish. "Erst Herveer, der alte Meister." "Thank you." Daniel bowed and stepped off the stage, and Regina started clapping loudly. Everyone else only started after her, as if they'd waited for her reaction, but she ignored that little fact. Instead, she gestured for her student to come to her. "The sorcerer's apprentice was an interesting choice," she commented. "Thematic, I suppose. And certainly one I would recognize." The young man ducked his head slightly. She sensed his faint embarrassment, but also satisfaction. It was Lady Galatea's suggestion, in truth. "I'd suspected so," Regina nodded. "Well, I certainly enjoyed your performance, and the effort you went to for it." Of course, she was probably the only person present apart from Galatea who'd actually understood it, but that didn't stop people from applauding him. She supposed high society art was like that, though a song might have been better, you could at least enjoy the melody then. "If I may make a suggestion," Lord Dane stood up, inclining his head. "Lady Galatea, you surely know many more songs or poetry of your common homeland. I am sure it would please all of us to hear more. Could you be persuaded?" "Great idea." Regina commented loudly before Galatea could answer. She smiled at her, wishing she was close enough to give her a playful shove. Unfortunately, Galatea was currently hovering 2 small tables away by a few drones and Kiera. They held eye contact for a few moments, before Galatea sighed in a theatrically put-upon way. Regina could sense she was actually just amused. She went to the stage and gave her an ironic bow. Of course, instead of doing the arguably nice thing and choosing a song, Galatea instead opted for just declaiming another ballad. And not a random one. Wer wagt es, Rittersmann oder Knapp / zu tauchen und Dyson Schlund? / einen goldenen Becher Werf ich hinab. Show off, Regina muttered under her breath, but she still had to smile. It was a long ballad, and of course Galatea could recite it from memory, fluently. She had no accent either. Regina closed her eyes for a moment and listened, almost imagining the descriptions of the roaring sea around her. Once Galatea finished, Regina again clapped enthusiastically. Galatea gave a bow that only looked somewhat ironic and flounced down again. I'm glad you liked it, she said drily. Nothing against my choice? Regina shrugged. At least I know Schiller, and this had some nice descriptions. She paused, adding, of course, it's kind of sexist at the end. Then she paused again, adding as an afterthought, and the demanding king couldn't possibly be a reference, of course. I don't know what you mean, Galatea said innocently, then grinned. A demanding king, your majesty? Dane interrupted before they could keep bantering. He'd walked over slowly, looking curious. An uncertain-looking musician was climbing the stage next. He throws a golden cup into an ocean abyss as a dare, a squire dives for it, then the king throws it again and says the squire will get the hand of his daughter if he returns, but of course he doesn't this time, Regina explained absently. There has got to be a story like that in local folklore, right? But anyway, we should keep quiet for the next performance. The next song was in global again, and Regina honestly found the melody a bit boring, but she still listened and clapped politely. It was a good cover for her to reach out to Dane's mind, though. Now, was there a reason you sought me out? She asked. Must there be an ulterior motive? My interest was genuine, he said. Regina raised an eyebrow just slightly. She knew that was true, but she could also sense his mind and she knew him, so she was aware that wasn't everything. But yes, there was something else I wanted to discuss as well, my empress, he admitted. I didn't want to disrupt this gathering, but I have some concerning news that I thought you would want to be informed of right away. Regina took a sip of her cup of tea to hide her expression for a moment. It was probably petty to be annoyed that work was intruding on her leisure activity when she'd kinda chosen it for political reasons in the first place. She glanced at Galatea, who was still there and had clearly noticed something was going on. I'm all ears, Regina said. There have been rumblings at court and among the nobility, Dane stated. I was uncertain about their seriousness, as I've alluded to in my reports. But now I have news that there is a meeting to be held this night, in Nerlia City. A meeting where I know several noblemen I have considered potential problems will attend. Regina stilled, flexing her finger slightly on the rim of her teacup. That's short notice, she noted quietly. How did you learn of this? I've cultivated several contacts on the outer edges of these circles, Dane said, giving a mental shrug. Unfortunately, only one of them was approached, and even then, the one who invited him was clearly hesitant. I fear if we bust this meeting, we will immediately see his access cut off, if not worse. He was also not told a precise location, apparently it will only be revealed once they are there. And if the contact wasn't trusted, that might be why they were only informed so late, Regina surmised. Unless the meeting was very short notice in general. It was lucky that Dane had anyone at all in place for it. But the fact that there was, what, a political faction? A conspiracy? Forming or already operating under her nose was not reassuring. In fact, if she didn't have to control her expression tightly, she'd be snarling. As it was, Regina very delicately placed her cup back down. I expect a full report, she told him. Have your contact attend this meeting, and be very careful. There's no point in trying to break it up immediately, I think. Instead, we want to identify who is involved. Unless you would recommend something different? The song ended, and Regina smiled and started clapping politely. Dane followed suit. No, I will do as you say, Your Imperial Majesty, he answered. My sincerest apologies that I am not able to provide more actionable information. I will strive to do better. Regina kept smiling slightly and briefly sent him a feeling of reassurance. It's fine, Robin, she said. I know you are working hard. My expectations are high, but I am confident you will meet them. She knew he was genuine, at least. Regina wasn't personally very close to Robin Dane, but she didn't have much cause to doubt him. He even seemed to have found a sense of imperial patriotism recently, from what she saw in his mind. He would probably still choose service to Kiera over her, but she suspected the last few years had changed his mindset more than he realized. And he genuinely despised traitors. The conversations around them quieted as another person climbed the stage and started another song. This time it was one of her drones, who'd brought along a guitar and had seemingly chosen a few old classics. Regina hummed along under her breath for a few notes. Should we reconsider our deployments and keep more troops at home, in light of this development? She asked. I do not believe that is necessary at this time, my Empress, Dane said. It is, of course, your call, but I feel our brave soldiers are needed on the front. These would-be conspirators are unlikely to muster enough will or courage to openly fight your rule. And even if they did try, they might only feel emboldened if the enemy makes gains against our forces because we have weakened our armies. Regina nodded slightly. All right, I'll trust your assessment for now. She hoped he wasn't just being optimistic, but he had a point, they couldn't afford to weaken the front lines. They fell quiet and she simply listened to the evening's entertainment for a few minutes before the door opened and someone else strode in. Regina glanced at them, already knowing what to expect. Zephyr looked more composed than he felt. He walked quickly, and the uncertainty in his mind, almost anxiety, caught her attention. She sighed slightly. What now? Was it too much to hope for one evening of light enjoyment? As expected, the mage headed right for them, being only polite enough to pass by the other guests without completely offending them. He declined a drink and slowed down as he approached, dropping into a bow. Your Imperial Majesty. Thank you for the invitation. Sir Derek, she greeted, gesturing at the space beside her in unspoken invitation. Dane hadn't taken a seat and was now backing away slightly to fade into the background, while staying close enough to listen in, she knew, but Zephyr had fewer scruples. He settled into a chair and leaned over to speak quietly. Your Majesty, I bring news, he said. She more sensed than saw him glancing at Dane. Has Lord Dane already informed you of the meeting this night? Yes, he has, she answered silently. Although I'm surprised you know of it. Did someone approach you? Zephyr shook his head slightly. No, not me, but, he trailed off, a little uncomfortable. Of course, his current lover. Regina sent a feeling of acknowledgement. I see. As long as no one actually breaks my trust to join a shady group like this, it's fine. No, Tarek didn't tell me, I simply found out anyway, Zephyr answered. Now the dark pall on his mind made more sense. The walls are too thin in their home, and he was careless. Regina turned, brushing against him and briefly laying her hand on his arm in the process. I see. I'm sorry. It can't be easy for you. But I appreciate your trust. As if you wouldn't already know who my companion is anyway, milady, he grumbled quietly. Regina hummed slightly. That was true, she'd never said anything and never would have outed him to anyone, but it wasn't exactly something he could have hidden from her indefinitely, regardless. Though that wasn't the only thing she meant, of course. Still. Well, things weren't going to last between us anyway, Zephyr said, still grumpy. I admit it took some restraint to not throw things at him as I left. But I'll have to wait to tell him it's over until the investigation is finished, I suppose. I appreciate your sacrifices for the Empire, Regina said drily. She did send a bit of genuine gratitude as well, though. That was not the only thing I needed to tell you, my Empress, he said, sitting up a bit straighter. It's who he was talking to. I wouldn't have thought anything was amiss if they didn't specifically talk about needing secrecy and to avoid your eyes. Did Dane tell you who else was involved? Regina had a bad feeling about this. Unfortunately not. Who? Naralt. Regina stiffened slightly, looking deeper into his mind for confirmation. Zephyr let her. Finally, she turned away, staring at the musician on the stage without really seeing her. Well, that is a surprise. She had really let things slip through her fingers, but there were so many balls in the air, she just couldn't personally keep up with everyone. Still, this was a bitter reminder of her limitations. At least Regina wasn't blindsided by this betrayal, she told herself. And she would have to give Zephyr some kind of reward for his loyalty, she supposed. Maybe she could find a wyvern egg for him? Chapter 422, Rest and Recovery. The feather hovered in front of her, wobbling slightly in the air. Janice focused harder on it, and instead of stabilizing, it seemed to get worse, like a gust of wind had shaken it. Then she lost focus and the feather dropped to the ground. Janice caught it in her hand, sighing in annoyance. She held the feather up and examined it critically. At least it didn't look like the ends were suddenly blackened. She still didn't know where that had come from. The thought that she would have easily been able to do something like this, before, sent a burning feeling in her gut. And it wasn't just the task itself, she also would have been able to do it with a heavy object, or several of them. But in addition to fine control, she'd also been struggling with raw power. She'd chosen a feather this time for an extended training session, to not drain her reserves so much, telling herself it was so she could focus on training fine control of her mana. But Janice still knew the truth. She had charted her improvement as much as she could. If her current projections held, she might need literal years to get her power back to where it should be. Janice refused to accept that. There must be a trick to it, something she could figure out. Her mana had possibly been drained, yes, but the capacity of her body to hold mana should still be the same, right? Especially if it was so intertwined because of her being a part elemental. One of the healers had said something about the wall of her mana well being ruptured, but that was stupid, because mana wells were conceptual abstractions, they didn't actually exist. For now, she put the feather down and ensured everything was where it should be in her training room. It was sparse, with room to move, and more importantly had good ventilation that could be closed tightly. It was a windowless room deep inside the base, so there was little risk of any other influence from wind, rain, or sunlight, too. Janice snapped her fingers, casting spark, before she closed her fist and snuffed it out. At least her system spell still mostly worked fine. She left, locking the door behind her, with a physical key, which she then pocketed. Since Janice was mostly focused on recovering and training, and currently living in the Hive base, she saw no point in excessive finery and was wearing practical clothes. Of course, they were still made of the best materials and decorated with some gold and silver thread. She might still have to meet people outside the Hive, after all. As Janice departed, walking down the corridor in no hurry, few other drones were present. Janice reached out to the psychic link, getting an impression of her surroundings and then moving further outward. The base had been expanded in the last year or so, though not at the same pace it used to, but it was still quite spacious by now, made up of an extensive complex of above-ground structures and tunnels. For all that, it was sparsely populated. Many of the Hive's drones were needed elsewhere, and few could be spared for manning its bases at home. More importantly, perhaps, everyone had tasks to do, and few of those tasks led them here. Even people that were mostly based here spent most of their time outside, tending to the swarm drones and overseeing the farmland that fed the Hive, and a good chunk of the rest of the empire. Janice hummed to herself quietly as she walked. She had tried to help with that important task. Once she got used to the weirdness, it was rather boring. No wonder the drones tried to trade off the duty of watching the hordes of swarm drones and guiding them across the Hive's fields. She was still a little limited by only being able to do it from here, though, even with the psychic link. And she had already got a few pointed questions and comments regarding if she didn't have anything more important to do. You know, being crown princess and all. The problem was that she really didn't. At first, Janice had been almost glad for the opportunity to finally relax a little, or at least tried to see it as a positive. She'd slept in as long as she wanted every day, read a few books she'd been meaning to, played around with her magic, though that was mostly for her recovery, magical physiotherapy, Tor called it, and it was kind of depressing, joined games over the psychic link or occasionally here in person, and even practiced her singing voice and tried to learn new songs. By now, she was getting a little bored of it, though. She would pester Max again about moving, Janice decided. If he backed her up and didn't protest because of security reasons, overprotectiveness, it would be much easier to convince Regina. For now, she went outside for her usual midday walk. The healers had recommended regular walks as a starting point before she attempted heavier exercise, and it helped with feeling a bit less restless, too. Janice stopped and breathed deeply once she left the building, enjoying the warmth of the sun. Then she set out into the countryside. There was a small field not too far from the base where the hive grew various kinds of flowers. Some of them were still cultivated for medicinal use or even as cooking ingredients, for flavor, but many of them were tacitly reserved for artistic pursuits. A few swarm drones were walking through the field right now, working. Which mostly meant weeding, which mostly meant eating grass and some weeds. They weren't smart enough for very detailed work and there was only so much you could do. Janice patted the nearest drone absent-mindedly as she walked, looking at the field of flowers. It suddenly reminded her of her dream quest and her meeting with Valence. Had she imagined it? She still wasn't entirely sure. If it was real, then she might actually have given up the possibility of becoming a proper psychic by joining the Hive. It was a bitter thought. Of course she didn't regret it, but still. Then again, even Valence didn't quite seem to be a psychic herself, at least not like humans, and there were actual psychics who had joined the Hive without having lost that ability, so the assumption was probably wrong. Regardless, she still had access to the psychic link. Janice left the field behind, taking a dirt track and heading towards a bench a bit further away. She was starting to feel out of breath, which was pretty annoying. She'd been fighting a war, even if she hadn't fought personally, a short walk of this length shouldn't be so draining. At least I no longer get dizzy. She looked up as a flock of winged drones blocked out the sun for a moment. They came from the south, probably one of the enclosures with drone breeders. They'd have a longer flight to their destination, which a quick check showed to be the northwestern border, but it was still the safest place for drone breeders to be put. They were scattered across the empire, but Regina had made sure to keep a number of them in the Hive's core territory, and there were always guards for all of them. At least her own bodyguards were giving her some space today. Janice appreciated it. They'd been a little overprotective at first. Janice closed her eyes and focused on her magical senses, not just to practice, but because it was a good way of seeing the terrain around her. She could sense the drones in the psychic link, but unless she looked closely enough to make use of their own sensory information, it didn't tell her much about anything else. Right now, she felt the elements around her, the shape of the earth, slightly sloping despite what felt like level ground, the hollows further away. There were tunnels beneath the earth, not the ones the Hive had dug. She remembered them, of course, although she wasn't sure exactly where her current position was in relation to what she'd seen before. But she had, by accident, walked pretty close to one just now, close enough to make out small creatures scurrying through the open spaces in the earth. Janice tilted her head, focusing more intently. They were monsters, probably? The tunnels hadn't had a rat problem last she knew. Tunnelers, maybe? She did know there were a few of them further down the tunnels. Janice sighed. If she wasn't weakened, she would be leading an expedition into the tunnels herself. It would be fun and good training, and it wasn't like she was too occupied by other duties right now. But she already knew how people would react to the idea, and to be honest, her heart wasn't really in it, either. She really wasn't strong enough to do something like that at the moment. For now, she only pointed a few other drones at the problem and watched as they made plans to send a few drones down there to take a look. They should probably secure the tunnels more, anyway, especially since they still had an enemy army approaching from the west. There were entrances in and around the Great Forest, so finding one of them probably wouldn't be that difficult, especially if they had help. Seeing that enemy army disappear into the old subway tunnels would not be good. Assuming they got that far, of course. Janice sensed other people approaching. She didn't turn to look, just kept sitting there and focused on her magical senses. Janice, Ices finally greeted her, coming to a stop beside her. After a moment, she settled down on the other end of the bench. "How are you doing today?" Same as yesterday, Janice answered. She glanced around. 2-star guard were nearby, but they'd taken defensive positions far enough away to let them talk in private. There were also a few swarm drones around, at work. No one else. That's good, Isays said calmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a few sweets, offering one to her. Janice took it silently. They sat there for a moment, enjoying the day together. Janice was pretty sure Isays was just checking up on her out of obligation, but she wasn't going to be rude to her because of it. How are you settling into your new position? She finally asked after a minute, deciding that starting a conversation was better than just waiting. Isays shrugged lightly. To tell you the truth, I'm not doing much. I have other things on my mind, and while the Queen's gift was certainly well-intentioned and is appreciated, I confess I have little desire to play a human noble lady. Janice hummed in acknowledgement. How were things handled where you are from? She asked curiously. I don't think you ever said much about it. Did your people have hereditary nobility or not? Isays was quiet for a moment, rolling another candy between her fingers. That is a more complicated question than you realize, she finally said. We elves did not have a single government even before the cataclysm. And afterward, of course, people from all sorts of different societies were thrown together and built their own new communities. By now, in the small states south of the Alps, it varies, although an outright monarchy with an institutionalized nobility is rare. And how was it where you are from? Janice asked. That depends on what you mean, Isays said lightly. My parents were from different societies, before. I spent most of my childhood in a southern city before my mother moved us to another one. It has democratic structures, but in practice, wealthy and entrenched families dominate the political landscape and have put barriers in place for anyone else to reach high positions. Janice nodded. She felt like she at least vaguely understood that. It sounds like it's a lot closer to Aridel than anything else I've seen, she commented. True, Isays muttered. It's a shame the Elvish Free State is still so unwilling to commit to the fight. Janice paused for a moment. It felt like there was a hint of genuine bitterness in Isays' words. Yes, it is, she agreed hesitantly. Are you planning to do anything about it? Isays actually smiled in response. Maybe. There is a reason I came south, and it's not simply to check up on you. Is it because the Confederation's Western Army is getting so close? I've heard they'll fight the elves soon, Janice probed. Perhaps. There are plans at work, my dear. And I should probably go, she sighed, standing up. Places to be, people to talk to. All right. If Lion was going to interfere in that fight, who was Janice to argue? Hopefully, they would take care of things without too much trouble. And the Hive did have drones in the area, so Janice would be able to keep informed. She knew the dwarves had also been preparing for it, but she was curious to see the elves stand and fight. You know how to reach me if your condition gets worse, Isays reminded her. I know, Janice answered. Good luck out there. She watched as Isays opened a portal. The other woman was doing it deliberately slowly and keeping her moves distinct, the pattern of her mana clearly evident, so Janice took advantage of it and studied her spell as closely as possible. She got a good look before Isays stepped through the portal and vanished. Well, that's new I guess, Janice mused. It didn't feel fundamentally different from the teleportation she'd seen Isays do before, and it probably wasn't her new champion portal-making ability at work, at least not directly, but it definitely felt like an evolution of her previous spells. If even an old mage like Isays can innovate and improve, I suppose that leaves a lot of room for me, right? Janice mused. The thought made her smile a little. It would probably be a while until she could actually work on teleportation again, but at least it was nice to have a goal in mind. Janice sighed, standing up and straightening out her clothes. She reached out to the psychic link and called a flying drone over. She should return to the base, but she wanted to feel the wind in her hair a bit first. And then she'd look for new books. Now that she had the time, she might as well read up on what she could. Especially subjects that Janice suspected the others had neglected, like theology. Regina seemed barely willing to grant the current world the use of the term. And maybe a few travelogues, but mostly that. It wasn't because she was curious about the chance she'd given up. But trying to figure out how the god's power worked seemed like a good task to tackle. She could bother Ices for more answers later, too. Interlude, Isolation 9. An old elvish adage held that the anticipation before a battle was worse than the battle itself. While it held some truth, perhaps it didn't therefore follow that the battle itself was good. And this particular battle was a vicious, bloody-minded thing. It was no mere raid for resources or skirmish gone out of hand, or even a regular conflict over borders. No, these soldiers fought because they felt for their cause. They'd either been convinced by their commanders, or perhaps they genuinely felt fervor for it. Either way, anyone who retreated from this battle would be condemned as a coward, which wasn't to say the two sides were evenly matched. One side clearly had superior numbers, and while the other might have a slight advantage in the level of their combatants, it would not be enough to turn the course of the battle. Of course, the terrain also mattered in this calculus. Tunnels made numbers matter a whole lot less, which was usually an advantage but currently felt more like a curse. Armin paused after fighting his way through a knot of enemy soldiers to contest a crossing of several tunnels, taking a moment to catch his breath and gather his strength. The unit he currently led, a small one pieced together from the remnants of several others, gathered around him, lifting their weapons and shouting in victory. The tunnels around them carried the sound, and echoed with similar shouts. It was hard to even determine which way they came from, much less what the lay of the overall battle was. Or rather, it would have been hard without certain advantages. Take heart, brave soldiers. The voice brushed at his mind, the words echoing through the group more firmly than any mere sound. The flow of the battle is in our favor. We have almost encircled the enemy on the left flank. 3 of 4 strong points have fallen to us. There is increased resistance on the eastern front, the watchtower must be taken. Now is the time to press forward. Capitalize on your success and punish their arrogance. I will help you sow fear among their ranks and show them why we are not to be taken lightly. Courage, now, for the eternal dark. Armin sheathed the sword he'd picked up at some point, he didn't really remember when, and grasped his trusty dagger. He smiled. Well, you heard her, he said. Onward, friends. The men around him cheered, and he let himself be swept up in their enthusiasm and bloodlust for a moment. He rushed forward, leading them through the next tunnel. Being experienced soldiers, they'd fallen silent and moved very quietly. Carefully, Armin drew on a bit of his mana to wrap shadow around himself and the front rank, hiding them a little better. It was an expenditure of mana that would hopefully be worth it, though he had to ration his mana carefully. The tunnel soon opened into another small cavern, and he charged forward. His blade found the neck of an enemy soldier. Shouts and cries rose, but his followers were already among them. Another heated melee ensued. The soldier to his right side was cut down, and Armin stepped into the breach, throwing his hands out and sending small projectiles of shadow at his opponents. They managed to blind them, giving his other soldiers an opportunity to capitalize on it. Then he jumped forward, relying on his superior stats. Another dark elf met him in battle, probably an officer. They exchanged blows, but Armin stepped in close, dodged a blow of his sword, and rammed his dagger into the gap between the enemy's armor plates at his armpit. There was a bit of resistance as the chainmail held for a moment before it broke. He stepped back, dodging another flailing blow, and turned to the battle. It was already over. They kept going. Madras contacted him again, giving him a more detailed assessment of how the battle was going and where she wanted him. Armin led his little band through 2 more crossings, picking up more reformist soldiers on the way. He finally paused before the last turn, looking at his soldiers. The last watchtower, he said. One company will attack from the northern tunnel to draw their attention, then we and another group will attack from 2 other tunnels. It's important to move quickly. Our goal is to take the tower structure itself. I'll handle any elites. Be careful and strike true. Then he drew on more of his mana and sped down the tunnel. He hadn't seen the cavern before, but Madras had shared an image of it, so he knew where he was. The cavern was perhaps big enough to house a village. It was low, but sloped upward on the right side. That was where the actual watchtower was located. Instead of being a real tower, it was built into the cavern and the top reached the rocky ceiling. The upper 2 levels were open enough to allow ballistas to be employed, but everywhere else it only had small windows and arrow slits. Armin didn't let that stop him. He charged forward, into a group of soldiers who'd formed up before the tower. Followed by those behind him, their charge disordered the enemy's ranks. He slashed at several soldiers, pressing forward. He couldn't stop. Instead, Armin condensed more mana into armor, stole another sword from an enemy and forced others back, trusting in his soldiers to guard his back where they could. Then he was through and close enough to the tower. The door was closed and barred, but he ignored it for now. Instead, Armin jumped up. His shadows enveloped him and wound through him. He passed through a window that should have been far too small for his frame, materializing enough to shove an enemy back inside the tower room. Then he lashed out with his blades and more dark mana, clearing the room. His arrival hardly went unnoticed, but it only took a minute to fight his way through the tower to the entrance and throw the door open. His company poured into the tower after him, and he turned, running up the stairs to clear the upper levels. There was only one opponent here who presented something approaching a challenge. At least, he withstood the first exchange of blows and almost managed to cut Armin's face. Armin paused long enough to take in his information. A blade dancer, level 58. Clearly an officer and probably from a leading family. House Anevian, that made some sense. It is truly a sign of the reformists' weakness, the man said, raising his sword in a mocking salute as they circled each other on the uppermost level, that they need a foreigner to lead their troops. So much for organizing themselves, right? At least the men I lead are fighting for their own interests, Armin responded calmly. And you think I don't? The loyalist shook his head, scoffing. This revolt has brought nothing but pain and chaos. But defeating you will bring me glory. Armin dodged, feeling another blade whisper past his ear. The man was quick, but not quick enough. He stayed on the defensive, gauging his skill and tempo. His opponent clearly had more of their abilities remaining than he did, but Armin still had higher stats. More of his soldiers hurried up the stairs, throwing open the door behind them. It provided a momentary distraction, but that was enough. Armin darted forward, stabbing a dagger of darkness at his opponent. The officer blocked it with an ability, a transparent force field that bounced his strike back. But the weapon was insubstantial, so Armin simply dropped it. He turned, grabbed the man's offhand, and locked his blade against his. They grappled for a moment. Armin got in close, stepping on his foot and kneeing him in the soft parts. The armor blunted the attack, but the dark elf still flinched back slightly. Armin took advantage of that to break the lock and slide his blade upwards. It found a gap between his opponent's pauldron and helmet, sinking into his neck. Armin stepped back, watching his opponent intently until he was certain the man was dead, then turned around. The fight was still ongoing, but the noise seemed to be winding down. Master Yelavan, we've cleared the tower, the highest ranking of the soldiers present reported. Our forces are securing the cavern. What should we do? Take some people and try to cut off the enemy from the eastern tunnel, Armin ordered. Make sure to capture as many as possible without letting them escape. The rest of you, get started on helping the injured, take stock of casualties. And inspect the tower. Is there any structural damage? The primary objective here was the tower, so he stayed to make sure it was secured. While the battle concluded and the cleanup began, Armin took stock of the situation. This was only one part of the larger battle, but he could tell that it had gone similarly. They'd won a victory today. Madras contacting him only confirmed it. Good work today, Armin, she praised. They have broken and scattered. I'm tracking the runners and stragglers, but most of them are regrouping in the straight tunnels to the northwest. They will probably withdraw to rejoin their main host as soon as possible, but I will send some skirmishers to encourage them to go in that direction. Good, then the way for us to link up with the main reformist army is clear, and we've secured the western approach, he replied, pleased at the news. It meant they had now secured a broad stretch of territory to the west and southwest of the Eternal Dark as well as the main approach to the reformist stronghold farther toward its center. With the fortifications on this main road in their hands, as well as those towns and strongholds they'd taken previously, it should remain that way unless the Loyalists made a truly concerted push for it, which they almost certainly wouldn't as long as the reformist forces were still there. Both sides would probably focus on a more direct confrontation, where they would try to bring as much of their forces as possible to bear. Now, Armin made sure the watchtower was in good hands, then decamped to meet Madras and the rest of their small army's leadership. They were already converging on a cavern to the east, where a small village used to stand, no more than a few houses. The inhabitants had left, probably to escape the battle, or possibly, they'd been displaced by the Loyalist forces beforehand. The houses were cleared out, so at least they'd taken their possessions with them. The army's leaders stood on a covered veranda where they'd be out of the way, but still able to see everything. "We should spend the night here, then move east as planned," Otimian said as Armin arrived. "There's no point in going out of our way to chase down the remnants of their forces, it would only delay us for little gain." "Agreed," Madras answered. She was already looking east, at the large tunnel leading in that direction, and ignoring the looks that the passing soldiers gave her. "I want to reach the council, as soon as possible. Perhaps Armin and I should go ahead, with a part of our forces. I trust you to manage the rest of them on the march." "I would also like to rejoin my fellows soon," Sarkle grumbled. He was favoring his right side, Armin noticed. "But is there news from the east, Yulavan? Have you spoken to them?" It was a little weird to no longer be Yulavan by default, actually. Otimian and Anedian, Alco, not the other, twitched slightly at, Armin presumed, the disrespectful address. For people who'd joined the soldiers' revolt, they were surprisingly fond of Madras' position, or just deferential to her. Well, that's fine as long as it's just her, and it clearly is. Of course Madras didn't seem to care. "Yes, I've spoken to a few people. The distance is still too far to talk at length, but they are aware of our coming. Their armies have advanced to the gate of the central north, now. And the last estimates we had on enemy forces still seem to be accurate. Our allies are preparing for battle. There is some debate on whether to encourage diplomacy first." He liked the way she put that, encourage diplomacy, because it was going to happen anyway regardless of what they did. This was good to know, though. "Then it sounds like we have little specific reason to hurry, at least," Otimian noted. "As I said, I would prefer to arrive as soon as possible," Madras stated with finality. "Expedite our departure." That was that, and the conversation turned to practical matters before they hurried away to see about various tasks. Armin lingered, though. He was not a soldier, or part of their structure, so everyone had decided to leave the organizational matters to the other leaders instead, and he was at a bit of loose ends when it came to times like these. Mostly, though, it was because he wanted to speak to Madras. "Is everything okay?" he asked as soon as they were alone. Madras sighed. He knew her well enough to read the conflicted feelings in her expression. "Why do you ask, Armin?" "It's been bothering me for a while, actually," he responded, also switching to speaking silently. Despite the connection, her mind was unreadable to him. "I know it's not just because you still have a bit of trouble with your speech." He'd gotten used to that, but it was still evident. "There's something else weighing on you, and I'd like to know why. And why you want to meet the reformist leader so soon. Is it about your family?" Madras remained quiet for a moment. "I suppose you should know," she finally answered. "I've been hesitant to tell you, because, well, I suppose it felt like talking about it would make it more real. But is ignoring a prophecy wise, even if it might be self-fulfilling?" She shook her head. "Regardless, just before I went to join you, a message from Regina reached me." Armin listened, trying not to judge as she related the Empress message. "A vision from a seer?" He frowned. "I can see why it would bother you, but, no, I understand. It's a lot to consider. But is that why you want to join the council so quickly?" He might have thought it would make her hesitant to come or involve herself in the war at all, if she wanted to avoid this prophecy. "I am not entirely sure how much I do want to avert it," Madras admitted. "Obviously, there are some parts I'd rather not see or do. That staircase of bone sounds unpleasant, for once, especially as a symbol. I'd rather not cause that much bloodshed. But the vision also implies we can win this war, and even that I could unite people behind our cause, perhaps? And most of all, I just don't want to leave this to others. It sounds like a lot of this might, or will, happen whether I'm present or not. I'd rather be able to anticipate and influence events rather than being caught by surprise. Yes, that makes a lot of sense. Armin nodded. And until we learn more, it's probably best not to worry about it too much. Indeed. Madra smiled sardonically. They were interrupted by other Dark Elf officers, and Armin went to check on the army's progress and help get it moving. But he still found his thoughts stuck on their conversation. That night, he found little sleep, and it wasn't just because he was sleeping in a slightly damp cavern. But at least everything seemed to be going very well otherwise. They made good progress, and having Madras, as well as him and Sarkle, with the vanguard seemed to lift people's spirits. They also traveled through friendly territory, or at least territory they'd already secured. Because of their scouts and Madras' warning, it also came as no surprise when they saw another group of dark elves approaching them. Outriders from the main host, apparently including some people who had come riding out to greet Madras personally. Armin slid into position to guard Madras back mostly by force of habit, watching the approaching dark elves. One of them pushed ahead slightly, but reined his mount in when they met. Madras, he finally said, a smile growing on his face. He visibly hesitated for a moment before getting down from his tamed beast. Madras stepped forward. Father, she greeted Lerman, showing little emotion in her voice. Perhaps there was more to her desire to get here quickly, Armin thought as he watched them. He smiled slightly as the father and daughter met and embraced. Armin looked at the other dark elves who'd come with him, mostly wearing the symbol of House Alleran. Everyone was giving the reunion a bit of space. Even Sarkle. Once the embrace ended, Lerman met Armin's eyes and inclined his head slightly. He looked decades younger all of a sudden. Praise the gods that you're here, Lerman said. We will need your skill and strength, daughter. Praise someone, anyway, Madras muttered quietly, almost too faint to hear. It's good to see you again. I will do what I can. That, Armin didn't doubt for a second. Although on reflection, it was somewhat funny that everyone seemed to be accepting her presence and even that she would be in a leadership position so readily, without even questioning where she'd been. Chapter 423, Dissidents and Informants. Regina didn't generally enjoy acting like this. However, occasionally some theatrics were appropriate. And she did have a few negative feelings to work through. It was easier to suppress the urge to do violence when she had two people kneeling in front of her in apparent contrition. Well, 3 people, actually, but she didn't hold anything against Dane. And usually he wouldn't have to kneel either, but the situation apparently called for it, and she would only show him preferential treatment in a deliberate manner. Regina leaned back in her throne-like chair. It wasn't her actual throne, since she didn't want to do this in public, for obvious reasons. She'd already made sure no one else unexpected was around to eavesdrop, and kept a bit of her attention on looking for other minds. You were aware of this for longer than you would like to admit, clearly, she noted. Marquis Relaines winced slightly, dropping his head further. I apologize, Your Imperial Majesty. I had little concrete information to go on, and did not want to raise unnecessary alarm. He hesitated for a moment. And to my shame, I was conflicted. I know there is a reason these men approached me, I admit it. I only hope to show that my loyalty is with the country and the crown going forward. Regina nodded slightly. While she wasn't sure how long he had been in some kind of contact with the more dissatisfied traditional nobles, though, she could tell, it usually wouldn't have been more than some grumbling at parties, he had been cultivated by Dane for a while now. And he had informed the spymaster and gone to this meeting to pass along information. I see. Feeling doubt on occasion is understandable, as long as it does not lead to wrong actions. I look forward to further loyal service from you, my lord. She paused for a moment, looking at them and tasting the shape of their minds. Then she glanced at Dane. Lord Dane, please fetch the written reports prepared for the occasion, then take your place at my side. Yes, my empress, he muttered, rising to do as she'd bid. You may rise, Marquis, she continued. Then Regina fixed her gaze on the last man still on his knees. As for you, Baron Theron, what do you have to say for yourself? The last nobleman lifted his head. He looked slightly defiant, though she could feel how hollow that feeling was. He didn't actually think he had done nothing wrong, either. It was just the natural tendency of people to think they were in the right. I could give an eloquent speech, Your Majesty, he said. But actions speak louder than words, and my most important defense is in my action, because here I am. I could have simply remained quiet, I could have participated in any conspiracy, but instead I spoke up, and I am now here, kneeling in front of you. My Empress. Regina hummed tonelessly. That you are, I suppose. And, indeed, perhaps you could have. What do you think, Lord Dane? That someone could have committed worse treason is hardly a valid argument to defend them, milady, Dane said. Should we give every proper, law-abiding citizen of the Empire a medal? That said, he is here now and that took courage, even if I expected better from you, Lord Theron. Regina nodded. You have a point. I would not call your actions treason, Baron, not truly. But I am also not inclined to reward you for getting cold feet, such as it is. Your information will be judged by its worth, and I will remember what you did, or didn't do. And I suppose having 2 informants is better than 1, she thought sardonically. Honestly, she'd also have expected better from Baron Theron, but perhaps that was stupid, since she barely knew the man. That he'd been a follower of Duke Bluegrass and thus on Kiera's side in the Civil War did not necessarily mean he shared Kiera's political ideals. I thank you for your mercy, Your Imperial Majesty, Theron said through only slightly gritted teeth. I will strive to prove my loyalty in the future. Of course. Regina smiled slightly. Do stand up. Now, tell me why, specifically, you decided to come, and I don't mean because Robin was there. She had her doubts about whether the Baron would have come forward if Dane hadn't visited him. Apparently, an already scheduled meeting about information regarding retired knights, ironically enough. It presumably helped that Relaines had pointed his presence out to Dane before. Theron maintained that he would have, and to be fair, he had pretty much spilled the information immediately, according to what Dane had said and what she could sense from him. She supposed they'd never know what would have been. Theron stayed quiet for a moment, presumably collecting his thoughts. I have been skeptical regarding the eventual goals of this war, my Empress, he finally said. As well as the long-term prospects for the Empire. But my doubts about the feasibility of fighting it have taken several blows recently. I have learned more about your factories and the pipelines that feed and equip our soldiers. The thought of fighting against the gods is not a pleasant one, but it does feel like we are winning. Regina nodded. But that's not all. No, I was also disappointed by what I heard at this meeting, he admitted. There was far too much talk about the glory of our kingdoms and the good old days. They hardly seemed to have any real plan for the future, or at least not one that considered the long term. Evidently, they were against the recent changes in the Empire's culture, and there was a lot of talk about what to do, but too little regarding their implications or where we would be in 20 years, never mind 100. Neither traditionalist nobles nor religious extremists are generally famed for their forward-thinking capabilities, she commented sardonically. I hardly know what you expected. But do go on, Lord Theron. What did they plan? If the instigators had a real plan, they did not share it with everyone, Your Majesty, he replied. Instead, this meeting seemed meant more to introduce themselves and each other and to connect everyone together. They spoke about building a network and letting those of us with justified concerns speak to each other. They also discussed security measures. Meeting places will be changed each time, with dates and locations only given to everyone shortly beforehand, and they established code names and code phrases. Dane cleared his throat lightly, continuing at Regina's nod. In your opinion, did anything they do actually constitute treason, legally speaking? Theron visibly hesitated. I am hardly as knowledgeable regarding the law as you, Lord Dane. Perhaps? I do not think they openly spoke of revolt, and they shied away from gravely insulting the Empress as well. Regina frowned. On that point, What is your impression, Lord Dane? They are evidently guilty, he responded promptly. But having more information and more evidence would be preferable. Regina nodded. Conspiracy against the crown was, in fact, on the books as a serious felony. Not the type that would see you executed immediately, probably, but it wouldn't be out of the question either, though in that case the charge would overlap with high treason. She could definitely arrest them, at least in the sense that she had justification and probable cause, but he had a point that there were still a lot of open questions. What is your impression, Lord Relaines? She asked. Do you concur in this assessment, or is there something else you would like to point out? The young Marquis was frowning thoughtfully. I would caution Lord Dane not to underestimate this group, he said slowly. I know for a fact there are several men that share their sentiments who were not present this day. It would not be completely surprising if they actually held several gatherings. And while they were clearly careful not to, directly, speak anything treasonous, I think that was on purpose, not due to any hesitancy they might have felt. I am hardly an expert at such things, but it strikes me as a simple rhetorical trick, where you start with small, innocuous statements, get your interlocutor to agree, and then slowly lead them deeper into the mires, until they are convinced they agree with a much more radical course. Perhaps something like that, anyhow. Regina considered their answers for a moment. Is there any indication that they are backed by or in contact with the Essamen or Westerners? Theron and Relaines actually exchanged a look, while Dane frowned more heavily. No, my Empress, I do not believe so, Relaines answered, while Theron shook his head in agreement. I see, Regina said. If you haven't already, please write down everything you remember of this meeting. Try to capture every detail and recall exact words if possible. Do not speak to each other until you have completed this task. Going forward, you should keep to your normal routine, but we will likely call upon you again, so be ready. They agreed, bowing again. Regina spoke a few more words to dismiss them politely and waited until they were gone to turn to Dane. She didn't trust either of these men enough to involve them in this discussion, but there was a reason she'd wanted to see them in person instead of just reading reports. At least she could be reasonably certain they were not secretly hidden psychics or affected by psychic mind control. Of course, that didn't mean at least one of the other people involved might not be. What do you know of these people's leaders, Robin? She asked, finally giving the files he had brought a proper look. It looked like there were dossiers of the people in question included. It seems none of the highest leaders holds a great title or a high political office, my Empress, Dane answered. At least, not as far as I can tell. Their exact leadership structure is frustratingly vague. Several men spoke at this gathering, but it would be foolish to assume they were the sole leaders, or even the highest placed. What's clear is that there is some kind of organization already, though. The question is how strict or flexible it is. I hesitate to speculate too much based only on 2 reports of a single event. That sounds like they appeared out of thin air, but they didn't, Regina noted. You had your eyes on them already, didn't you? Or did you truly miss this entire thing completely? Dane hunched his shoulders slightly. Many of the people we have identified were familiar to me, he said. But this speaks to a higher level of organization than I had previously thought possible. I never identified the leaders as warranting so much interest or thought that the discontent had already veered so far into treason and conspiracy. A short-sighted failure for which I must apologize. Don't beat yourself up too much, just work on fixing this, Regina replied, turning the page. She stared at the picture for a moment. A good rendition, given that they still didn't have photographs, at least not ones convenient for normal use. Regardless, Tarek Destan was one of the people listed as potential leaders, though probably not the ultimate leader of this group. Zephyr's partner, or ex-partner? Zephyr had said he would string him along until their investigation was finished, looked like nothing special. Regina wondered what he saw in the guy, but honestly, while she must have had the capacity to understand that kind of thing, she'd clearly lost it. Shaking her head, she continued, flipping through the rest of the dossier. Most of these people she was at least vaguely aware of. She paused on the last page, staring at a familiar face for a moment, then snapped it shut with a vengeance. The paper caught on her claws for an instant and tore slightly, but she ignored it. So, she said abruptly, recommendations for dealing with them? Should we send in the police, the military, my psychic students, or just observers? Dane straightened up, clasping his hands behind his back. For now, I recommend putting them under increased observation, but remaining as covert as possible, my Empress. As our informants said, there are likely more people involved whom we have not identified yet. I would prefer to make a clean sweep, so to speak, once it comes to that. Of course, we need to keep monitoring the situation and reassessing based on current factors. See it done, then, Regina replied with finality. So, no letting anyone know we're on to them. Pity. She'd really wanted to summon Nerald and show him her displeasure, but she could recognize that impulse was unhelpful. I'll keep my younger students out of it for now, but I will be taking opportunities to peek at the minds of those involved wherever possible. Prepare your informants without tipping them off. Be alert to any signs of potential psychic influence, and send me your agents to double-check their training where possible. Also, keep me informed. He half bowed. I will, Your Majesty. Good. I believe you have work to do, then. Regina paused briefly. On that note, I wanted to ask about your assessment of the situation to the west. Dane nodded. The elves have finally asked for support from us, he noted. The dwarves are best positioned to provide this support at the moment, along with some flying drones. Current reports indicate they will clash right away, the battle might even have started already. It seems it has, Regina said, quickly reaching out to the psychic link to check. The initial phase, at least. Diplomatically, I advise keeping all of our promises, but we should not need to throw many of our troops into the grinder just yet, Dane said. This is their territory. We have been fighting the majority of this war, bearing its brunt without their help. The elves are ready for this fight, and operating on their home ground. They must take point. Noted, Regina said drily. He wasn't the only person who thought so, and she understood the reasoning. It didn't mean she hadn't already diverted troops. Ben was drawing up more plans and adjusting deployments as they spoke. But she did understand, and she wasn't eager to throw her drones into this particular chasm either. Regina focused on her drones on the ground for a moment. There were still Imperial diplomats in Aridel, of course, along with some other drones, and Imperial forces, mostly just officers there for coordination right now. They were currently starting to clash to the west of the city of Aridel, farther out from her position and her reach. She assumed the Westerner army would be trying to advance on the city to take it, but it couldn't be their immediate goal. The elves were ready to defend their territory with blood and steel, and Regina remembered enough of the last war fought over it to be confident they'd make the enemy bleed. Ices was already present as well, Regina noted. She was speaking to the leaders in Aridel at the moment. Well, at least that was one champion on their side. Now the question was whether the Westerners' champions could do enough to tilt this fight in their favor. Regina suspected it would take a while, if nothing else. From flying drones, she'd watched the elves prepare their ground. The forest was their home, and they knew how to trap and decimate unsuspecting human soldiers in it. Chapter 424, Approaches and Commanders. Eturkaeni leaned on the balustrade of the watchtower, looking at the meadow and trees in front of him with narrowed eyes. Still think I should have given the elves the benefit of the doubt, Temel? They did step up now, Turka, Idamel replied mildly. Turka sighed, shaking his head a little. He truly didn't understand these elves. They were the Hive Queen's allies and were just as impacted by the war as his own people. Why had it taken a literal invading army to get them to move out of their comfortable homes? Not that they were likely to have much common ground, he supposed. The elves did have a nice, comfortable city, long settled, with all their elders and children. Well, that and a few smaller settlements. They certainly had much less cause to worry about a group of monsters suddenly devastating their home. Or wandering around human-controlled territory where they were viewed with suspicion at best. Most of the fighters now looking to him for leadership had spent a significant part, if not most of their lives, south of the mountains, among the hills, plains, and rivers, with the human and occasionally elvish city-states. Turka was actually unusual for a dwarf in how much he'd lived in the mountains even before their treaty with the Empire, and even he had ventured out for months or years several times. So much had changed since then. He supposed he couldn't really blame the elves of this city for not seeing things the same way. They must have been much less impacted by their contact with the hive kind. Even if it still felt to him like they were trying to weasel out of their obligations, despicable behavior. But I haven't even seen whatever treaties they must have, he reminded himself. And they were here now. This outpost had been built by Aridal, along with 2 lines of others extending outward from here. There were several bigger forts as well. His own soldiers had helped with the construction of some of them. They would be needed. The main enemy host was only just visible in the distance. They were still camping just outside the forest proper, but they weren't just sitting there, instead, they were constantly in motion. And they were sending more and more soldiers into the forest. Turka lifted his spyglass to his eyes, looking through it. It was partly hidden by the trees, but he could still see the clash between one of their vanguard forces and an elvish unit. His allies had sent signals as he watched, other rangers were coming to support them. The Westerners could clearly see that as well, and they were starting to disengage and retreat, or at least trying to. The elves weren't letting them get away that easily. "What are your orders, Commander?" Temel asked, interrupting. Turka straightened up slightly. "We must coordinate closely with the elves going forward," he said. "I do not want to strike on our own and risk upsetting one of their plans." The elves might not be their direct allies, officially, but they were their allies' allies, and both of them were fighting on the side of the Empire, so it was good enough for this war. Which meant he had a duty to ensure that his fighters behaved themselves and respected their allies, especially since they were fighting on their allies' home ground. Not that Turka had ever thought he would be in this position. His encounters with the Imperial soldiers and Princeling and his involvement in the talks with the Empire had raised his status with his people far more than he could have expected a few years ago. It was good to see his people be more unified, but also slightly daunting. He was still a little surprised that so many had agreed he should lead their contribution to this war. "Commander," one of his men shouted from the ground. Turka glanced down, then gave Temel a nod and started down the stairs. He took them quickly, grateful that at least they had been sized for his people, and emerged in the small yard of the outpost, which was laid out like a typical, if rather small, castle. Before he could do more than call a few soldiers over, the charged feeling of mana in the air expanded, forming a small hole. It grew with a slight pop sound until it was the size of a doorway, then closed right after its maker stepped through. Turka relaxed slightly. "Lady Ices, it is good to see you," he greeted her, respectfully inclining his head. The old elf smiled back. "Likewise, Commander Turka. How are things going here?" Reflexively, he glanced west again, though it was hard to see anything from here. "Largely as expected," he admitted. "They've started to push into the forest, but they are not being reckless so far. Our allies are still holding their probing attacks off. I am expecting this to change shortly." Ices nodded seriously. She looked slightly tired, he thought, but that might just be her age. Or it might be the strain of teleporting around the area, more likely. "I hope your efforts have seen the same success," Turka continued. "Is there further news? I hope Aridal's leadership is being cooperative?" "Yes, they have agreed to provide me with resources," the priestess said with a nod. "It seems the imminent attack on their city has finally managed to get through a few thick heads, just between us. But that's not all, unfortunately. Their scouts have also identified a new threat." "Have you kept eyes on the enemy army?" "Of course, we've been watching them as closely as possible." "As have the drones," he pointed out. "Then you have seen the strike forces they've sent underground?" Turka sighed slightly. "Of course those would come back to bite us," he grumbled. "I've seen them send teams through an entrance a few times, and I know the flying drones have seen a few more. I confess I'd rather hoped they were killed by monsters underground. But I assume what we've seen wasn't all of them." Ices shook her head. "No. On the contrary, some people have suggested that they must have split off forces before even reaching this position, to scout the tunnels. Regardless of whether that's true, the Free State scouts and a few of the drones have managed to locate a large enemy force assembling in the tunnels. They're afraid they might be gathering in order to emerge at an entrance close to the city and attempt a pincer attack. Turka frowned in thought. The other option would be them trying to bypass the city to strike at Hive territory, he mused. But that seems less likely. Most agree on that, but we shouldn't lose sight of the possibility, either, she replied. They are making plans on how to respond, and I think your presence would be valuable. If you'll allow me? Of course, but give me 1 minute to brief my subordinates, please. Turka called Temel over and relayed what the champion had said, then made sure he was aware of what to do. Then he collected 2 more warriors to escort him and turned back to Lady Ices. The elf gestured and he felt her mana settle into a pattern before another portal opened. She hastened through it, and he quickly followed with his warriors, unsure how long she could keep it up and unwilling to drain her reserves. The sensation was odd, mostly because it didn't feel any worse than taking a step down a staircase. It took Turka a moment to orient himself to his new surroundings after they'd stepped through and the portal disappeared behind him, leaving no more evidence than a mild breeze. They were in the city, he recognized after a moment. Specifically, Ices had led them to a small open area just below the city walls to the south of the greater settlement. Turka took a moment to settle himself before focusing on the other people present. Several military officers, he noted. He had seen most of them before. There was also a group of political leaders he recognized. Most notably, Special Minister Eltarianal was speaking to a familiar commander, her daughter if he remembered correctly, not far from the gate. They turned as Ices and Turka approached, and a few of the other elder elves broke off their conversation as well. In the end, they formed a loose half-circle of politicians and officers, with Ices and him at one side. It made him feel a little like he was at one of those tribunals the Western Riverlords liked. At least these elves looked friendly. Lady Ices, Commodore Turka, and Ice greeted them briskly. Good timing. We were preparing to send a strike force beyond the walls into the tunnels, to disrupt the enemy's advance through them. What intelligence do we have on their movements? Turka asked. If they wanted him to send troops along to this fight, which seemed likely, he'd rather know what he was getting into. We have estimates of their numbers and current positions, one of the officers spoke up. He started to give a report on what they'd seen. One of the mages projected an illusionary map into the air to help illustrate it. Turka listened closely, taking mental notes and considering which of his soldiers were likely suited to which task, accordingly. The current plan is to establish a beachhead inside the tunnels, here and possibly extending up to here and here, the younger Eltarianal said, drawing on the map with a few sparks. We will commit as many troops as necessary to this stronghold and would like your support. Once this is accomplished, we will send an expeditionary force, or possibly several, into these farther tunnels to hamper the enemy's advance. If possible, secondary goals are to reduce their numbers and prepare potential traps, such as cave-ins. It will also give us better information on their advance. We expect they'll coordinate the timing with a push from their main army above ground. Turka nodded. That sounded sensible enough. I understand. We have not committed many soldiers to the fight directly yet, so I should be able to send at least 2 war groups with you. I will come along personally to establish this stronghold. We are quite experienced in such matters. That raised a few eyebrows, but he didn't much care. Dwarven commanders led from the front. If he tried to stay back and simply direct everything from the safety of the city, he would quickly find himself replaced. Not Turka intended to do that either way. Good. Ejern will command the base and Annuus will command the strike force, another old man said. This caused a bit of muttering from the others. Judging by the dark looks they shot the special minister, they were probably thinking it was nepotism. Not a promising sign, but Turka resolved to withhold judgment for now. Fantastic. Ices clapped. I will accompany you on the initial push as well. Unless there are any objections? There weren't. Instead, they proceeded to hash out the details, after Turka sent messages back to his troops. He stayed to participate in the planning. Fortunately, it didn't take very long for the officers he had sent for to arrive, and their companies after them. It also became clear why they had chosen to meet here. The elves clearly meant to be quick about this. The discussion had made it obvious they meant this to be an elite force. Numbers would be worth less in the tunnels, especially in the battle they anticipated fighting. It necessitated some reshuffling of troops. With everyone present and preparing to set out, the area was still rather crowded, but in a remarkably short time, they were ready. Turka walked with Annuus Eltarianal and the most senior elven officer, the subgeneral called Ejern. He wasn't sure about the officer's last name, since the system didn't show it and it felt rude to ask right now. They discussed the disposition of their forces, until they reached the entrance the elves had chosen. It looked rather inconspicuous, in truth. He barely even realized there was something like a cave there, until they cleared away some brush and tree branches and he realized the elves had put up netting to hide it. Removing the foliage revealed a relatively big tunnel entrance. The elves marched through confidently, and not to be outdone, Turka followed, at the head of his fighters. The march through the tunnels was quiet and tense. They'd sent scouts ahead, but his little group was still at the head of the column, walking closely together to squeeze as many fighters into one row as possible. Their sounds almost covered the sudden clashing of metal and what might have been a yelp from ahead. "A fight up ahead," the commander announced. Before she could say anything else, a scout returned, visibly sweating a little. "A hive of tunnelers," he reported breathlessly. "They must have moved in recently." Turka gripped the hilt of his sword. "No time to waste, then, let's go." Ejern barked a few orders, and they advanced. Turka made sure to be among the vanguard, and was pleased to see several other dwarves falling into line with him, strengthening the group. To their credit, both of the elven captains did the same. Another scout stumbled forward, and they parted to let him through. Turka hoped their healers farther back would be able to heal whatever had him covered in blood, but they didn't stop. Instead, they sped up. When they finally met the tunnler colony, it was in a larger cavern. 2 more elven scouts were getting swarmed by them, both visibly injured. Turka steeled himself and used his first ability to boost his defense. "Forward, split and envelop them," he barked. They were veterans and didn't need much further hand-holding. Turka joined the line, advancing forward, and raised his sword to skewer the first tunnler to charge his fighters. The elves to his left had pulled ahead slightly, and their line buckled under the assault of tunnlers turning to new foes. But they held. Turka sped up, trusting his men to follow suit, and hacked into the main swarm of monsters. They were vicious, and the dwarf to his right had to use a skill to get one off his shield before it overran them. Turka stepped forward slightly, using his superior stats to push them back and create breathing room for his comrades. Despite clearly being hard-pressed at first, the elves managed well. He suspected they weren't used to fighting with allies, but their 2 sides managed to get into a rhythm. They advanced forward, taking advantage of the stone walls of the cavern to pen the monsters in and make sure they had nowhere to run. The elves flowed, their formation shifting until a group rushed forward like the claw of a beast, pincering the tunnelers and pushing them away from the other end of the cavern, where it led into a new tunnel, to keep them from running. After that, it was only a matter of time. Turka wiped his sword before he walked up to the elven leaders. "A good warm-up for the fight ahead," he commented. "I think that was our biggest fight until we establish a proper stronghold here," Annuus said. "It's a shame none of our long-range scouts has reported in yet." "Perhaps, but I am afraid a bigger fight will be here sooner than expected," Ejern said. He walked to one of the tunnler corpses, turning it over. It took Turka a moment to realize why. There was a piece of metal wedged in its mouth. It looked like the monster had bitten down on something and it had deformed enough that the tunnler couldn't get it back out. Carefully, the elf worked it loose, then held it out to them. "A copper piece with the symbol of Gidiarno," Annuus noted, examining it closely. "It looks like it came from a bigger object, perhaps a decorative frill that was twisted loose, or even part of a large coin worn as a medal." "Terzias, take a look at this." Another elven soldier joined them. He took the find and closed his eyes, clearly activating a system ability, then put a hand on the tunnler corpse as well. "They came from the northwest, originally a small side shaft about 2 leagues away," he reported. They encountered the wearer of this on the main throughway close by. I assume there was a fight. It feels like several of its colony were involved. Tejoka frowned. The soldier must have been using a psychometric skill. He'd heard of those, although they were rare. What he'd found was more concerning. So, at least some Westerners are already here, he noted. Scouts or perhaps more than that? It's unlikely to be a single scout if a large group of monsters was involved, especially if they caused a group of this size to migrate, Annuus said. Most likely, it's at least a proper advance party of scouts. Either way, we need to move quickly, Ejern said. Dispose of the corpses and move. We must secure our area of operations before their vanguard gets here. Tejoka nodded, turning back to his people. He still saw Annuus grip her bowstave tightly, and knew her job had just gotten harder. But perhaps more vital. They would need to use some mages or perhaps ask one of the Empire's psychics to locate their enemy more precisely as soon as they had their staging ground secured, but he also suspected the answer would be closer than he'd like. Which in turn implied the Westerners might be preparing for a large push toward the city very soon. Chapter 425, Scouts and Skirmishes. Annuus Eltarianal stared into the darkness and smiled. She didn't particularly care that she was given a dangerous mission, that she would most likely be facing an enemy with superior numbers or that enemy champions might pop up to make her life even more difficult. She looked forward to it. And not simply because she would be fulfilling her duty to defend her city-state or for an asinine reason like getting recognition for it. No, she was glad because they were finally doing something. In her opinion, it had been a special kind of torture to be forced to sit in Aridel, organizing patrol schedules and going on the occasional mind-numbing patrol to stare at empty trees, while their allies were fighting the war of the century and her own people sat on the sidelines, unmoving. While quite possibly the fate of the continent was decided around them. To her shame, Annuus had almost been glad when she had heard about the Western Confederation army coming from their western territories and realized that this would force the government to finally respond and actually let them fight. She wondered what they'd thought would happen if and when the war finished without another major upset. If the Westerners and Esseman won, did the assembled elders really think they would simply leave Aridel to carry on in peace? Of course, some people she wouldn't name were clearly trying to swing the government to support the Westerner alliance instead. So it was not a deliberate deadlock. That did not make it any better. Good luck out there, Commander, Ices Alturiel said, also looking into the darkness and frowning slightly. I do not have a good feeling about this. Thank you, my lady. Annuus inclined her head. You will not be joining us, then? She hadn't been entirely sure. The champion had stayed back so far, perhaps to conserve her mana. Not that they had needed her help. But Annuus knew that Lady Ices had already been teleporting several times today. It was probably depleting her reserves, so rationing her mana made sense. It didn't explain why she would come with them in the first place. It would make sense to stay in the city where she was aware of the enemy advance and was able to go where she was needed. But perhaps she'd wanted to get a look at the tunnels and the defensive positions they would build here herself. The thought of relying on an elf of her seniority in a combat role made Annuus slightly twitchy. This should not be necessary, but by all accounts being a champion of the gods counted for quite a lot. And the tactical implications of her portal had the entire officer corps almost literally salivating, too. No. I will be marking a position here, to ease teleportation to this base, Ices replied. I was considering doing the same if your troops secure a forward position, but given that our timetable seems to be tighter than expected, I might be needed in the city. She hesitated for a moment, then seemed to come to some decision. I will stay here unless and until I'm needed elsewhere, though, and if you can establish secure communications with the city where you will be, I can join you there as well. I will do my best. Thank you. Curiously, Annuus watched as Ices apparently got started with her plan, but she had to admit it went over her head. Annuus was hardly specialized in magic. But to be fair, the mages in her company also seemed to be scratching their heads. After a moment, she turned away to organize their sortie. For this part, she would only use veterans. 2 companies was likely already at the upper limit of what she could quickly move through the tunnels and expect to maintain a minimum of stealth, but this was supposed to be reconnaissance in force in a sense. These soldiers were all at least at level 30, mostly higher, and had at least 2 centuries of experience. Annuus spoke to the squad leaders and made sure everything was prepared, then reported to the general before setting off. Ices watched them leave with a serious expression, and raised a hand in farewell when their gazes met. The tunnels were dark and cramped. She split her strike force in 2 for the first major leg of their planned trip, knowing that these 2 tunnels would meet up again after a while. It had been some time since Annuus was here, but she remembered them and had acquainted herself with their maps. Both companies would send single scouts or small teams into the side passages along the way. For herself, she led the way through the bigger tunnel, where there were more likely to be monsters or enemy activity. Her intuition proved correct, and they encountered several more tunnelers along the way. Fortunately, the monsters were only present alone or in small teams. Annuus had forbidden the use of large-scale magic in the fight, or anything else liable to make sounds that would travel too far in these conditions, but her company managed to put them down with little trouble. She wet her own blade in a tunneler's blood as well, conserving her arrows. She'd never liked fighting in tunnels. Her favored weapon was the bow, but it was less useful in these conditions. Still, there were opportunities in larger caverns, and it wasn't like she was unskilled with other weapons. "Be quiet now," Annuus ordered, striding away from the corpse while 2 of her soldiers cut it up for transport. Leaving anything behind was a rookie's mistake. "Aliern, Oneies, scout ahead using your stealth skills, and return to me immediately if you find anything." "Yes, Commander," Oneies replied, her form turning indistinct as she triggered her class skill and flashed away from the group. They kept moving, quietly and carefully. Neither of the scouts she'd sent ahead would return for now. By standard protocol, one of them would wait at the next major cavern or thoroughfare they found. Annuus was considering who she might leave behind to man key locations as they went on. She gestured at one of her mages, and Erasus sidled up to her. "Have you sensed anything of note?" she asked, pitching her voice low in a way she'd trained so wouldn't carry through the tunnels. "Not yet, Commander," he replied equally quietly. "Keep scanning." They pressed on a little more carefully, now that they were getting close to where they might encounter enemy forces. Annuus tried to visualize the map of the tunnels. The occasional slight turn in the path they followed made navigation more difficult, but she was still certain of where they were. As expected, once they reached the next major cavern, Aliern was waiting for them. The scout made himself visible as they approached, coming to report to Annuus. "No signs of the Westerners so far, Commander," he said. "The path splits up ahead, so I would recommend sending more scouts." "We found no other sign of monsters, or of any other life either." Annuus nodded. "All right, good work. Tevern, Arius, join them in scouting. Return once your time remaining for your ability gets too low. Aliern, you should take point." Then she turned to the others, and named 6 more of her soldiers, those who were good and light on their feet, to establish a second scouting screen. Normally, she might have joined them. But something about this situation did not sit well with her, and she felt she needed to be with the main host of her company for now, to lead them if they did face something unexpected. Besides, while she was good at stealth herself, she was hardly the only one they had. They continued on until Oneies finally reached them again. She came sliding out of a side tunnel, materializing almost on top of Annuus. Annuus had already drawn her sword and only barely pulled her blow, letting it whistle past her head. "Damn it, soldier, be careful," she reprimanded her. "That could have been your face." "Sorry, Commander," the scout gasped. "But, I saw." "What?" Annuus asked sharply. "A group of Westerner soldiers," Oneies reported, finally straightening up and standing at proper attention, though she was still breathing heavily. "At least the size of one company, I believe. They are only half an hour or so behind me. The last I saw, they were at the large cavern where this tunnel crosses orthogonally with an old underground track." Then they could have taken one of the side tunnels as well, Annuus realized, though it seemed unlikely, if the group was this big. "All right. You're sure they didn't see you?" "Positive, Commander," the scout replied. "Good. Take a minute to catch your breath, then go ahead. We must be careful, but we need to know which way they're going, and we can still reach a good defensive position, Annuus said, scrambling to remember the terrain. The other scouts she had sent out should be returning soon as well, and they had hopefully managed to locate this enemy group without giving away their own presence. Annuus drifted back to speak to their mages and get their assessment. They must have some kind of shielding in place, Commander, Erases said. Now that I know where they are, I think I can sense them, a little. But it's hard. They must have a defense against being detected at range, probably a high-level class skill or even a champion ability. But something that won't protect entirely against actual eyeballs. You're telling me, Annuus muttered. This wasn't good. At least they had seen the enemy now. She briefly considered pulling back and avoiding the Westerners entirely. But if they were coming this way, they would encounter the rest of their forces eventually. If they were of superior strength, maybe Annuus could lure them back to meet the rest of their forces camped in their new forward operating base. That would involve handing the enemy a lot of intelligence, though. They would learn about the base and how many troops were stationed there. Better to intercept them now and beat them back if possible. Annuus called one of her other soldiers over and dictated a message to be sent back to the base, and another to try to coordinate with her second company, then ordered the company to advance again. They could at least get to a better defensive position. She pushed her soldiers hard for the next league or so. 2 more scouts joined them, giving her more details on the enemy company. Fortunately, they managed to reach the place she had in mind in time, while still receiving sufficient warning of their approach. It was another cavern in the tunnel, where a natural hollow had been expanded. A row of stalagmites and stalactites could be turned into an impromptu fortification, and they would have an advantage against the enemy coming in from the tunnel entrance with its narrower mouth. Commander, they're coming, and they've definitely identified us. Now, Erases warned her as the soldiers hurried to put up some field fortifications. Annuus finished stringing her bow. She nodded. Focus on the defense. If they have earth mages, take them out first. She pulled an arrow and waited, hiding behind a large stalagmite outcropping. When the first human shapes appeared in the tunnel, she had to remind herself to breathe steadily. Her soldiers were veterans and didn't make a sound or attack in a rush. Annuus waited until the first human soldiers stepped into the cavern, taking just a moment to identify her target, before she let the arrow fly. It pierced the soldier's throat, and he fell back, gurgling. She was already sighting the next arrow. Taking the signal for what it was, her soldiers joined in seamlessly, and arrows and spells rained down on the front ranks of the enemy forces. They crumbled immediately. Cover! Back! Retreat, someone shouted, only just audible over the noise of the fight and the wounded. Hold, Annuus told her company, holding her next arrow but not pulling the bowstring yet. She squinted into the dark tunnel opening. The humans were retreating in a disorganized mess, but a quick count showed only 8 of them were lying on the ground. Whoever commanded them had to be inexperienced, but they clearly weren't a total dunce. When the next attack came, they rushed in covered by large physical shields as well as faintly glowing magical shields, crossing the distance quickly. Annuus loosed one more arrow and gritted her teeth as it was intercepted. Her fellow soldiers did the same, but only a few spells found any success. And the humans were too quick to endure the barrage for long. Before she could fire again, a man who must have used a charge-type skill was right on top of her, swinging a mace. Annuus dodged to the side, drawing her dagger with her left hand and striking at his slightly exposed side. It got him to back off enough that she could stow her bow with her other hand and draw her sword. Then she pressed him, angling so he was constrained by the stone around them. The next swing of his mace opened him up just slightly, and she cut his leg. That decided the fight. It only took 2 more exchanges before it was his neck. Annuus danced to the side, putting a blade into the thigh of another human soldier who'd attacked an elf beside her, and quickly glanced around. The fight had devolved into close-quarters melee, and their improvised barricade was taking heavy damage. In the cramped confines, the humans' heavy equipment showed its worth. But they were still losing against her elven soldiers. In a pure contest between 2 fighters of the same level, she would always bet on the elf, There was a value to having decades or centuries more of experience and honed skill that mattered more than petty tricks and allowed them to punch above their weight class, as Ray had said. Suddenly, the world erupted in blinding white. Annuus felt like time froze for an instant. Everything was heat and then pain. When she finally managed to get her bearing again, she was lying on the ground, half buried beneath a collapsed pile of stone. She carefully moved her fingers, still trying to get her head to stop ringing. It seemed like she'd been lucky. Her left arm was still in pain and she could feel the wetness of blood, but at least her spine was intact. "This is the famed might of Aridel," a scornful voice said. "What a joke. Which of you else is the leader here?" "Champion," she realized. It must be a champion. No one replied. Annuus tried to look around carefully. Several humans were on the ground as well, but it seemed like most of them had weathered this attack or been shielded. There were still sounds of fighting. Some of her soldiers were retreating back through the tunnel, and a few had taken the opposite one. Others were probably wounded or playing dead for now, too. "If no one speaks up, I might as well go and kill you all one by one," the man threatened. Annuus shifted. She mustered all of her strength and pushed the broken stalagmite off her, carefully regaining her feet. There were dark spots in her vision and she swayed for a moment, but at least she didn't fall. Her sword was lying beside her, and she managed to pick it up. When she turned to the leader, he was grinning. Finally. At least you're not a coward. Shall we cross blades, then? Erek of Asiaton, level? Paladin spellcaster. Annuus didn't point out that she was heavily injured and any fight between them would hardly be fair. "If you stop talking," she replied instead. He only grinned wider and, deceptively casual, thrust his warhammer at her. Annuus dodged, trying to find her footing. She could tell that the man was likely more focused on using magic, but he was no slouch in melee combat either. A few probing attacks from her sword were easily deflected, and he tried to back her against the wall of the cave. Still, he was clearly not taking this entirely seriously. Even when she managed to slip aside and put more strength behind her blows, he still fought with the air of one showing off at a party. Not that she minded, it was easy to favor her left side and to gradually slow and feign more weakness than she felt, as if blood loss was slowing her down. As the fight wore on, it got harder to dodge his swipes, and she still hadn't managed to land a real blow on him. But his confidence was not shaken. And he still wasn't using magic, possibly some kind of power play? "No, it's more likely he can't," she mused. That was a stupendous spell, even if it was granted by his champion status, he must have blown his entire mana pool on it. The rest of the fight was downright predictable, almost as if it was choreographed. She suspected they both felt that way, but only one of them was right about their interpretation. Annuus found her moment when the champion let up slightly after another blow of his hammer. She had taken this one on her left forearm, only a glancing blow, but still enough to make white-hot pain shoot through her whole body. She stumbled away, and he laughed. "Ready to give in yet?" he taunted. "I'll make it easy for you, elfling." Annuus slumped forward, her sword dropping, feigning exhaustion and weakness, swaying slightly. "Maybe one thing," she mumbled. He leaned forward slightly, but his posture was still too open, too unthreatened. Annuus called on her last class skill. A lance of light formed in her hand, at first hidden by her hands and slumped posture, before she thrust it at him as it expanded. He jerked, but didn't manage to dodge it. The lance pierced his heart. "Priests and paladins," Annuus mused as she took a step closer, twisting the weapon and reinforcing the divine magic with her will, until he crumbled. "Always so surprised when someone else uses tricks like yours." The champion gasped. She leaned closer. Too late, she realized he wasn't speaking to her. "Do it," he rasped. "Collapse the tunnels." Annuus yelled and twisted the lance, before pulling it out and brandishing it at the cavern, but it was already fading. The skill manifestation had a strict time limit. Around her, the other elves who'd been wounded or silent were getting up, trying to regroup. But there were still too many humans. They'd been content to let their leader have his duel, but now they rushed her. She managed to get her blade into one more man's heart before a blow from behind brought her down. Then an insubstantial hand wrapped around her throat, choking her out. She struggled, but didn't manage to get free before blackness swallowed her. Chapter 426, Operations. There was an old saying, something about a misfortune rarely coming alone. Or more simply, when it rains, it pours. It felt like it should be an axiom of military strategy, too. And today, it seemed like the Westerners had set out to prove the point. Regina had mostly kept the Empire out of the battle that was currently ramping up in the Great Forest, so far. Partly, that was because she didn't want to step on the elf's toes, because having 3 cooks probably would spoil this broth, and admittedly also because she was irritated at their dithering and didn't see the point of sending her armies to save them from their own stupidity. That didn't mean the Hive wasn't present at all, though. Not counting their dwarven allies who were working with the elves, there were enough drones there to give her an understanding of the situation and how it was developing, which wasn't good. The elves had sent some of their best on an expedition into the tunnels to secure them against a western assault. Regina had tracked their mines establishing their base camp, from which they'd also send out scouts. However, the Westerners seemed to use that chance to press the elves heavily above ground. With several presumptive champions in the lead, they had already overrun several of Ariadne's watch posts and minor to medium-sized fortifications in the forest. The dwarves had clashed with parts of their army, but then Temel seemed to have decided to withdraw for now, probably because he wasn't confident the elves could back him up, given their position. Regina was just about to check on and track their scouting parties, both above ground and underneath, when she got another panicked message over the psychic link. It only took her a moment to grasp its meaning. The message came from the garrison of one of their northernmost posts inside her range, but they'd actually only passed on a message from farther away. Ada was reporting enemy movements and asking for reinforcements. Regina mentally reached out to Ben, to include him, then focused on the most senior drone in that garrison, diving deeper into their mind, to see the whole message with all of its context. Considering the psychic link didn't reach that far, it had been impressed into the mind of a swarm drone, a neat trick even if doing it like that left some precision to be desired. The winged drone had also been injured, and the remains of a string tied around its neck, with the ends looking burned, implied it had carried a written message as well. This is probably not the first message Ada tried to send, Ben surmised. They must have intercepted at least one other one, probably recently, or she would have just sent a bigger armed escort, but we might be missing some information. That probably has something to do with the information she sends, Regina commented. Even more Westerner troops. I suppose they've had time to mobilize them, since she's mostly been sitting in that city. Yes. Let's see. A larger army is approaching from the northwest, and the towns and bases we've already taken are increasingly under attack. This still seems like their strength is somewhat dispersed and not entirely concentrated. It also confirms their tactical goal must be to encircle and isolate the army, cutting off a major portion of our strength and halting our advance further into the Confederation. Regina sighed mentally. Their logistics were already stretched to begin with, advancing farther into the Western Confederation was not an easy matter. Currently, they were connected by a chain of garrisons and outposts along the major roads and waterways, but Imperial control of the areas outside those was still tenuous, and the army was too concentrated to focus on controlling a wide area. Which meant that, while they had punched relatively deeply into the Western Confederation, it wasn't exactly a straight front line. Where are they getting all of these soldiers? She grumbled. Are they just collecting armies off the street? I wouldn't be surprised if some of the soldiers are indeed conscripted, but probably not most of them, Ben said reasonably. The Western Confederation has not, thus far, tried to use massed unskilled levies. They have to know it would be useless against our artillery. Let's not forget the Western Confederation has a large territory and a large population. They might well have already raised troops farther away and it simply took some time to march them here. Or they could have been getting soldiers from other nations, Regina said, not bothering to hide her unhappiness at the thought. Either through direct contributions from allies or simply hiring mercenaries. The northern countries likely wouldn't refuse them that. Scandinavia or the Baltics didn't have a high population density, from what she knew, but they still had soldiers in large enough numbers. And her information on them was frustratingly sparse, especially for what had been the Nordic countries. Having to venture through the Western Confederation made getting any intel on them very difficult. But Regina knew there were several settled kingdoms up there, and while they tended to war among themselves, she hadn't heard about any recent conflicts. A good point. It's likely, Ben agreed. We'll have to see if our informants can give us more information. I suppose they might have some trouble integrating foreign mercenaries, but admittedly not as much as we would have. Regardless, the source of their soldiers doesn't really matter right now. True. Regina shook her head. They were getting stretched thin. Tim was still fighting the Esseman, and so was Sir Owen and June's army. The dwarves were tied down fighting the Westerners' large Western army, and the Imperial forces in southern Nerlia and western Cernlia would likely be needed there sooner or later, too. And even if she decided to send some of those forces as reinforcements up north, would they even arrive soon enough to make any difference? It would have to mean basically shifting forces northward, but even that would be dicey, she suspected. That is definitely an issue, Ben said, clearly following her thoughts. Can you ask Ices if she might be able to help? If we can assemble a strike force here and portal it to a good location, we can surprise them and we might be able to turn things around for Ada. Regina paused for a moment. She had been reluctant to ask Ices to use her new champion ability to make portals, and the old elf herself had clearly felt reluctant, as well. It was a hell of a trump card to hold in reserve, for a strategic move. But this situation probably did warrant it. And the clock was ticking, anyway. If nothing else, Ices had apparently started using her capabilities more directly, teleporting herself and others around, and had apparently developed some kind of mini-portal spell for it. Regina was dying to ask her to explain it. Hopefully, they would get an opportunity for a longer talk soon. All right, I will, she replied. Feel free to get started on organizing this, and figure out where a good location would be. I'll talk to her and try to help settle things in the West. Regina looked around, glancing at the documents on her desk. She'd been interrupted while doing paperwork. Luckily, none of it was extremely time-critical. She still would have liked to make a dent in it, but that would have to wait. Instead, Regina reached out to Ira, who was currently finishing up meetings with the palace's managers. I need some time. So, I need you to cancel my next meeting and maybe shift the one after that around. She felt Ira mentally riffle through her schedule. That's the meeting with the Arts and Culture Council regarding the educational integration for the orphanages and state schools. They won't like it, but I suppose they'll have to be patient. After that is your meeting with Iknes Allerin. Are you sure you want to cancel both, Mother? No, I still need to meet with Iknes. See if you can reschedule that for later. Thanks. Iris sent a mental acknowledgement, and Regina stood up, stretched, and moved to her bed, settling down cross-legged. Then she dove deeper into the psychic link, focusing on the west, where she could sense the cluster of minds that was Aridel and the Westerner army beyond it. It was more chaotic than she'd realized. Some of the elves' minds were downright screaming to her senses, not those involved in the fighting to the west, that would be expected, but ones in or around the city. Regina frowned and tried to look deeper. She was getting a bad feeling about this. It was a little hard to be sure just from a surface scan like this, and she didn't want to intrude deeper into their minds, but she was starting to get a suspicion about what was going on. It wasn't improved when she found Ices herself, currently rushing to and fro in the center of the city, then heading out to the southern wall. She was riding a tamed beast, some kind of horse monster, and barely slowing as people jumped out of her way. Tentatively, Regina reached out to her. Ices, hello. How is it going? Not good, Regina, she answered curtly. Annua's strike force is scattered and broken. I've got conflicting reports, but none of it sounds good. The Westerns are up to something in the tunnels, I just know it. The Western approach is buckling. And to make it worse, because this wasn't damning enough, we found traitors in the city. Ah. Regina winced slightly. How many? How highly placed? Would my students be of any help? Several units of the army, Ices responded. She finally reached the gate and jumped from her horse, quickly tying it up somewhere and striding forward as she talked. No one too high-ranking, unless they have hidden political backers, and it's easy enough to deal with them on their own. The issue is that they've already sabotaged our defenses. And I don't think there is time to bring in anyone else who's not already here. Regina waited for a moment while Ices readied herself. It was easy to see that a company or so of soldiers had occupied one minor gatehouse on the wall. From her connection to Ices' mind, Regina could tell it was where some defensive wardstones were kept. Other soldiers of Aridel were already gathered to storm it. Ices joined them quickly. Regina kept silent, letting the events play out. It was plain to see that Ices was a known and respected quantity here. In a remarkably short time, she was leading an assault on the gatehouse. She used spatial magic, some kind of warping effect, it looked like, to buckle the outer wall of the structure. Several other mages cleared the debris and the frontline fighters stormed in. Ices stayed in the back, but supported them with magical shielding and a few other spells. The battle was over relatively quickly. Regina watched silently, trying not to distract them, but she felt the deaths. Also, the building was rather worse for wear in the end. Ices cursed slightly as she entered and looked around. Then she sighed and went back out. Not to be disrespectful, but I assumed there was something else you wanted from me? She asked Regina. I actually did contact you for another reason, yes, Regina said. She carefully transmitted some information regarding the messages she had received and the general state of the war in both this theater and the one in the north. I was hoping you would be able to help us get reinforcements to Ada, and ideally, even construct a longer-lasting portal to connect us to her position and shore up that area. It should stabilize the city and also tie down enemy forces there. Ices visibly paused. She contemplated it for a few seconds, while Regina didn't pry too deeply into her thoughts. Finally, she sighed again. I can see the logic, my Empress. Normally, I would be happy to do it. However, I have to admit I'm more reluctant given the situation here. I have a feeling it's going to get worse before it gets better. Maybe, Regina answered. But to me, things actually seem worse in the north right now. You can wrap up what tasks you currently have here, but time is of the essence. And we only need you to establish a portal. You could come back to help Aridel after that. I would need to meditate a little to recover my mana first, and I'll be completely drained after making it, Ices complained a little. But I suppose it's the best we can do. If I'm leaving and going to be useless for a while, I have a small request for you, though, if you deign to do it. What is it? I'd like you to locate Annuus Elterianal. She was the commander of the forward scouts sent into the tunnels. I like her, and frankly, I don't want to know what will happen if the special minister's only daughter is killed or captured by the Westerners, but I doubt it would be good. Besides, knowing what went on down there would be quite useful, and I think a psychic might be our best bet, under the circumstances. Of course. I'll look into it and do what I can, Regina assured Ices. Then I'll get ready to make the portal. Thank you. Regina sent another feeling of understanding and acknowledgement, then mentally withdrew from Ices. Instead, she focused on the state of affairs in the city and the surrounding forest, before homing in on the concentration of mines underground. It was quickly obvious that something was indeed wrong, because the Westerner forces actually seemed to be retreating. Not completely, some of them were holding position, but others seemed to be moving back. Meanwhile, the elves and dwarves, and a few Imperials, were still preparing to face them in their underground base, where they'd been throwing up fortifications and preparing to funnel an oncoming attack into killboxes with the help of the local geography. Regina made a mental note to check on their preparations in more detail, then went to track down the individual units of enemy soldiers, looking out for Annuus' familiar mind. It took a few minutes to find her, escorted by 2 squads of Westerner soldiers, heading westward in the tunnels toward an opening that would let them emerge in the forest relatively close to their army's current positions. They were getting pretty far away from her, unfortunately. The elf was clearly injured, but had been treated, given what Regina could sense. They'd bound and shackled her, so she had to be carried, and had blindfolded her to boot. Regina reached out carefully. Empress Regina? Annuus asked, surprise pulsing across her mind. This is an unexpected honor. I hope I didn't hit my head and start hallucinating. Well, at least she was still mentally on the ball, and she'd managed to stay perfectly still and give no sign of surprise to her captors. "No, it's really me," Regina replied. "Ice's tipped me off to look for you. It seems our enemies are up to something in these tunnels." "You realize they're carrying you away from the front line back to their main host?" "I guessed as much," Annuus replied. She was clearly trying to focus, but still exhausted, injured, and dehydrated. "I killed an overconfident champion of theirs, so I suppose it could be worse." "I don't suppose you could help me escape, Your Majesty?" Regina had been considering that. "I could perhaps knock out the soldiers around you, or give you enough of an opening to flee by attacking their mines, but I can't guarantee success," she replied. And it ran the risk of Annuus being killed in the attempt. "There are other Westerner soldiers between them and your base. Running back would be risky." "Then it's better not to try it," the ranger replied, feeling resolved. "I will simply use this as an opportunity for infiltration. They clearly want me for a reason. We have no eyes inside their army, this will be useful." "Exfiltration from there would be at least as risky as trying it now," Regina warned her. "Nothing worth doing is easy," Annuus replied with a shrug. Regina suppressed the urge to sigh. "Well, I'll help if I can, and if not, Ices should be available." This should be enough time for her to finish her portal. And she had to admit it did seem like a good opportunity. "Thank you, Empress. It will be fine, but wait, forget about me. Before they captured me, the champion said something about collapsing the tunnels. You need to warn them, please." Regina clenched her teeth. "Can you show me?" "Focus on the memory of your encounter." Annuus did as instructed, and Regina quickly replayed the last few moments of the man's life. It was rather distorted and lacking in sensory details, as most memories would be, but the important parts were clear enough. "This just figures," she sighed. "I'll have to leave you to it for now. Your comrades, and our dwarven allies, need to know." "Yes, please do." Regina disengaged and focused on the base again, finding its commanders. She already knew they would be reluctant to evacuate their just-established stronghold, but it was probably the safest option. A cursory scan didn't show any explosives, and not nearly enough people present to collapse something like a significant part of the tunnel network conventionally. The Westerners would probably use magic, maybe a champion's ability, to collapse the tunnels. They might even have sent this expedition to get a map used to do it remotely, and they'd probably lured the elves into sending troops down here on purpose, to be caught in the collapse and wiped out. She just hoped the warning wasn't too late. Chapter 427, Theaters of War. When she'd received the news that their enemies may be trying some kind of scheme to collapse the tunnels under the forest, Ices had almost turned around and abandoned her plan to instead investigate the issue and help with the investigation. But she overcame that impulse. Regina would not be happy if she did that, and she was probably correct about where their priorities should lie. If nothing else, Regina had a better overview of the entire situation, and she was the Empress, after all. Besides, Ices didn't want to mess up her allies' plans by not holding to what she'd said she would do. That kind of thing never ended well in her experience. So, she drew a little more deeply on the divine mana she had access to and then teleported herself. It was considerably easier than it had been before she'd become a champion. The empowering effect of it really was noticeable. Not that she would have struggled with this distance before, but she had already opened a few portals this day, and yet she was ready for some more. It was gratifying. Especially since Ices needed to make another teleport shortly afterward. Regina had not actually remembered to tell her where she wanted this new portal, and Ices did need someone to plan this, so she teleported back to the capital. Fortunately, it was simple enough to find a drone and ask them to relay her question, and Ben met her in person to explain what they wanted. Ices took the opportunity to have a quick meal while they talked, wishing she had time for a nap too. Apparently, they didn't want an open portal too close to the capital or any other sensitive location, which was reasonable enough. Instead, the marshal directed her to a field near an imperial military base in Nerlia, some distance north of the city. Due to the geography, it was easy to reach for the reinforcements they were apparently already gathering here, but still separated from the new capital or any other major city by a significant distance and a few mountains, which should at least slow attackers down. Isays took a moment to center herself and look around, ignoring the drones currently giving her space. Several companies of Imperial soldiers were lined up, ready to head through the portal immediately, their battalions organized behind them. She looked at the one drone who was currently standing beside her, focusing on her magical senses for a moment. They seemed strong enough. Ken, would you do the scrying? We need a location that is not blocked. I cannot teleport in blind. Of course, just a sec, Ken responded. He gestured and opened a scrying window in front of him. There was scrying static at first, until he managed to move to a position that seemed best for their purposes. Isays leaned a little closer, studying the view to familiarize herself with the area. There had been some debate about this matter, apparently. Ben had not gone into much detail, but Isays could venture a guess why it was controversial to place a portal in or near an occupied city. In the end, the need for a location that could be properly secured had won out over convenience. Not to mention the element of surprise offered by the initial appearance of the portal and the soldiers sent through it. She supposed the strategic implications of sending supplies and logistics might be more important in the long run, though. Isays focused on the place she could see through the scrying window, trying to imagine actually being there. Then she pulled on her mana and mentally triggered the activation of her ability, Traveler's Gates. There was a slight sound like far-off thunder, a flash of light cycling through parts of the rainbow and a moment as space warped, and then she stood in front of a gateway to the other location. Isays grimaced slightly, feeling the drain of her mana. Erecting this portal had cost her most of her mana. At least it still seemed to hold true that the trickle required for its upkeep was very small, regardless of the distance. She stepped to the side and the first soldiers rushed through without pause. There was no one waiting for them on the other side, both as a safety measure and to hide what they were doing from the enemy as long as possible. Isays watched, glancing at Ken's scrying window more than the gateway itself, as the soldiers, a mix of drones, human veterans and a few gnomes, hurried through it and spread out, establishing a cordon for more of their comrades to come through. There were no signs of anyone else present, especially any enemy soldiers, and no signs of a fight, but she supposed she approved of the professionalism. What, exactly, is your immediate plan here? She asked Ken. Somehow, in all of the trouble she had not heard much about it. In the immediate term, we'll split up and send a few troops to establish contact with Peziton, he explained. The rest will go west. We have had reports of Westerner attacks on occupied positions, bases, and patrols south of here, and good estimates of where several enemy detachments are. By emerging here, we should have cut them off from their support, so we'll wipe them out and secure the area. We're close enough to the city to be supported if there turn out to be more enemies than expected, but also, that's why we have flying scouts. The 2nd Battalion will move in after the 1st and establish proper security here, holding the gate area, for now. It's why they have extra engineers, and Tia sent one of her ments. Have you met Liv? So they'll build some fortifications. On both sides, eventually. Isays nodded. She waited until there was a break in the stream of soldiers, then indicated her intentions and went through the portal as well. Ken followed, looking around and calling a few words to the other soldiers. Well, you seem to have things well in hand, she commented. Is there a place I could try to recharge some mana? I'll be available in case there's an unexpected issue. Of course, thank you for doing this, he answered, smiling with apparent sincerity. I think it would be safer to do it on the other side of the portal. There should be a grove a bit farther away if you need true privacy, or you could just use a room in the base, and we can assign a few soldiers to act as guards. Isays thanked him and headed off back to the military base on the Nerlian side. If she had the time, she might have tried to hunt a monster and attempt to copy Galatia's trick. Instead, she got a small private room in the Imperial base and knelt down on a rug, ignoring the protesting creak in her joints. She closed her eyes and started clearing her mind. This meditation was more useful for trying to recharge the divine mana she had access to than refill her own, normal mana well, but she would have to be content with that. Time slipped away as Isays meditated, quieting her mind and immersing herself in the mana of the world. When she finally emerged from it, it was perhaps an hour later. Isays stood up, wincing slightly at the stiffness of her limbs. Her high stats did help, but they could not stop the effects of age entirely, and she was old. At least she had managed to refill her mana well somewhat. Once she returned outside, she could see that things seemed to have gone well. There were new barricades and the skeleton of a new tower growing beside them, and a group of drones were discussing some other aspect of the project. From what she could gather, it seemed like they wanted to completely enclose the portal, to be able to shut it off from the rest of the construction in this place if the other side was captured. Building the fortifications on the other end also seemed to be proceeding well, judging by the glimpses she caught. Ices looked around, but didn't see Ken. There was no time to waste, though. Instead, she asked another drone to pass the word that she was leaving, and she would stay close enough to other drones to be contacted if they sent a message over the psychic link. She also got an update from the drones regarding what had happened in the west, using the psychic link, to make sure she wasn't running into any nasty surprises, before she departed. Once she returned to Aridel, Ices realized their short summary of what was presumably a status report in the psychic link understated things. The magical shield around the city was in pieces. Parts of it were still visible as bluish shimmers in the air, but most of the space around the city was unguarded. She could sense the remnants of the shield and the huge holes in it. The enemy's sabotage had clearly accomplished what they'd wanted. And I failed to stop them in time, she thought bitterly. How many innocent people will die because their defenses were breached? At least the battle itself had not been lost yet. On the contrary, the elves of Aridel were holding their own remarkably well. Ices moved herself to a higher vantage point, the roof of a tall building, to get a better look. The walls showed some damage and had probably been breached in a few places, but they were still holding. The Western Army's vanguard was engaged with the Imperial Allied forces, but most of their army still seemed to be moving into position. They had set up some artillery pieces that launched attacks at the walls, but only a few, presumably because of the terrain. And 2 of those emplacements were already smoking husks, destroyed by elvish strikes. But that wasn't all. The Empress' efforts to evacuate the underground had clearly also borne fruit. Ices recognized the familiar magical signature of Commander Turka and several of the other people who had been there once she looked for them. And there were distinctive gaps in the tree cover. She was too far away from the important parts of the tunnel network, but at least the damage didn't seem quite as cataclysmic as she'd feared. Still, the indicators she could see didn't bode well, either. Something about the distribution of troops on both sides still looked odd. Following her senses, she made her way through the city. She'd arrived in the biggest open yard that wasn't currently occupied, due to safety reasons, and it took a few minutes of hurrying through the streets until she reached the destination she had in mind. It was one of several military centers in the city, combined logistics bases and command and analysis centers. The people she really wanted to speak to were further at the front, but there were still some she could work with here. Captain Temmel, she called, striding over to the dwarf and nodding at a few soldiers who jumped out of her way. Lady Ices, he paused in his conversation, then stepped aside a little so she could see and gestured at the elf he'd been talking to. Have you met Sentry Captain Tyrius? Captain, good to see you again, Ices greeted him, nodding. How fortuitous. I wanted to ask about the situation. I successfully completed the portal to the north for the Empire, but it means I was out of the loop for a little while. Of course, Lady Ices, Tyrius replied, inclining his head. They're pressing the attack hard, but we have still managed to slow their progress down. The city shields are all but useless now, and our mages are scrambling to get adequate shielding in place. Last I heard, it is going as well as can be expected. We were discussing some strikes at key positions or enemy commanders to slow them down and gain more time. We also managed to evacuate most of the soldiers sent underground. Unfortunately, several of our scouts could not be reached or return in time. I see, she replied. So the Westerners did collapse the tunnels? How did they do it, and how bad is the damage? We're still unsure of the how, exactly, but likely with magic, Temmel put in. They collapsed perhaps half a dozen tunnel segments outright, with others cut off or made impassable due to other damage. They withdrew their own scouts through several entrances first, including one that was apparently supposed to have been destroyed long ago. It's unlikely they will move a larger force through what remains, but not impossible. So, they did not exactly destroy the entire tunnel network and sink the forest, Isays mused. Due to our evacuation, you would say? Almost certainly, Temel nodded. They must have adjusted their plans once they realized trapping and destroying the forces we committed there would no longer work. You have to hand it to the Westerners, Tyrius said. Even when we foil their plans, they always manage to turn things to their advantage somehow. Indeed, that's true, Isays replied, thinking back to the Northern campaign, and to a few too many assassination attempts. She shook her head. Are there any other foiled plans I should know about? Tyrius smiled slyly. Well, Eredal's soldiers haven't been entirely idle, even before they reached us. I happen to have been involved in a few special forces operations. Let's just say there is a reason they have so few artillery pieces to show for this assault. Ah. Isays had heard something about that. She nodded, but got back on track. And the battle? Has the Empire sent reinforcements? Yes, Temel said. You must not have seen them given the walls and tree cover, but several wings of winged drones are already engaged in the battle. They have also sent some war drones ahead of a proper army. The horde is going to hit the Westerners from the north. Isays smiled at the news, feeling a bit relieved. She knew that must mean that the Empire was stretched thin in this region, but the drones were unquestionably more needed here than in other bases. Before they could continue the conversation, they were approached by another drone, someone she didn't know. Excuse me, Lady Isays, they asked. I was told to let you know that the mission you spoke about before your departure is still an issue. We may need your help. The Empress or one of her students will be in touch shortly. Isays resisted the urge to close her eyes and pinch the bridge of her nose. With everything else, she had almost forgotten about that situation. Thank you. Please give me 1 minute. I do hope they manage to rescue the commander, Tyrius muttered when she turned back. Knowing she's in enemy hands. I know, but Commander Annuus is adaptable and experienced, she will survive, Temel assured him. True. I suppose things might be more dangerous for the Western soldiers near her, he commented. Well, I hope so. I suppose we can count on you if they are planning a rescue mission, then, Isays said. Or a decapitation strike, Tyrius said. He looked more animated now. That would fit rather well together, wouldn't it? Isays grunted noncommittally. She had a feeling things were going to come to a head, but it was better if she encountered enemy champions in their camp rather than in the city, she supposed. Chapter 428, Champions. The Western Confederation had brought considerably more soldiers to this battle than the Elvish Free State and their allies put together. Annuus had known this, but seeing it still drove it home in a different way. Their soldiers swarmed through the forest like a big hive of locusts, chopping down trees, setting up defensive positions, fires or tents, digging trenches, and everything else one would do before, or during, a battle. It was busy to her other senses, as well. As expected, there were quite a few magical shields in place. Rather than a single big one, they popped up like soap bubbles, and a few seemed to overlap. That wasn't the only thing, however. Divine mana was also present in this place, in a way Annuus had not truly sensed before. Partly, this was because her ability to sense it was new, and had grown since she acquired it. She'd leaned into this aspect of her class's power more than she had thought originally, choosing a class skill based on divine mana, and trying to develop her abilities. But it was also evident that there were champions here, and many priests or acolytes. What are you staring at? The soldier escorting her snapped. Annuus ducked her head, looking at the ground, then glanced up again carefully. At least she was walking on her own 2 feet once more. They had treated her injury with some kind of delayed effect, long-term ability, and it had progressively healed since then. Now it was faint enough not to bother her anymore. She had also finally gotten a cup of water an hour or so ago, which had at least helped her ability to focus a little. She was still tired. Annuus knew she should have taken Empress Regina's help, or tried to escape on her own while they were still in the tunnels. At best, when they had taken the exit in the forest. But something was telling her that this was the right choice. It would be dangerous, of course. But she had a feeling it was where she was meant to be. Where she could do the most good. Already, as Western soldiers escorted her through ranks of their fellows, they were moving in a large half-circle to detour around where the actual fighting was occurring. She had seen much that would be of use to her city. She closed her eyes for a moment to dwell on the feeling of the ambient divine mana, trusting her feet to find their own way, something that was not made easier by the iron chains still wrapped around her ankles, forcing her to take small steps, along with having her hands shackled behind her back, though at least they'd taken off the accursed blindfold. Annuus said a few words of prayer to alien eyes. It at least helped to calm her. Then another of the soldiers pushed her and she stumbled forward, exaggerating the movement a little. She had taken notice of all of their weapons and where they carried her own possessions, but she'd have to bide her time if she intended to make use of this. For now, she tried to hide her staring as they quickly marched forward. It was easily apparent that they were bringing her to an important leader. Whoever it was remained out of the actual fighting, but was close enough to oversee it. There was a pavilion set up on a minor hill offering a good vantage of the area. The closer they approached, the higher the levels of soldiers standing guard, and there were more fancily dressed men as well, along with simply dressed men and women with lower levels and variable classes, who she only belatedly realized must be servants. Just like human leaders to bring so many servants to a war, she thought contemptuously on reflex, before correcting herself, well, the Empire wouldn't do that. There was actually a small group of people at the top of the hill, watching the battle and occasionally barking orders to the runners and mages with them. They were all dressed in either fine robes or armor with fancy designs and decorations. There were more precious gems than she'd seen in even Nerlian high nobles' equipment. Several of these almost radiated with divine power, though to various degrees. Annuus wondered how many of them were champions. Probably only the few whose power was most visible, while the others might be church or order leaders, fanatics, with her luck. General, Grandmaster, one of the soldiers escorting her said, bowing deeply. We bring the prisoner, as expected. One of the other soldiers kicked her legs, and she let them drag her to her knees reluctantly. She still kept her head up, not bothering to hide her defiance. They wouldn't expect anything else, anyway. Soldier, no need for that, one of the men spoke up. He wore gilded armor and a fancy sword, with several large metal medallions on his belt and a silken sash. About middle-aged and classically handsome for a human. Ladies deserve to be treated with respect, even if we are at war. Lars Seaborn, level? Knight champion. Annuus stood up, glancing at the assembled men. They stared at her. I am an officer of the Elvish Free State, not a lady. My lord, I presume? Grandmaster, he corrected. I am Grandmaster Seaborn of the Order of the Lights Temple, at your service. That was a subsidiary, chapter, or general outgrowth of the Order of the Sun Temple, if she recalled. Annuus nodded slightly. Doesn't your chivalry ever get tiresome, Lars? The other man at the front of the gawker scoffed. He stepped closer, eyeing Annuus up and down. Are we certain this is the daughter of their old minister? Robert Venaber, level 41 Arcane Knight. Annuus didn't answer him, not that he was looking for an answer from her. She assumed this was the general. Their lack of last names in this system is truly annoying, another man piped up. Judging by his position, he was not one of the actual leaders. But she does resemble the portrait I saw. Maybe the man had been sent as a diplomat, then. She didn't recognize him or his fellows, although she took note of their system information, too. Good, then perhaps this underground scheme was useful after all, the general said. In my experience, few women hold steady to their convictions when their only child's life is threatened. Few people who see mortality approaching do, either. Annuus scowled. You want me as a hostage? Then I'll have to disappoint you. The Free State is not going to give you any concessions in return for me. And my mother is only a minister without portfolio, anyhow. The general smiled at her. A smile that had no right to look so bright. If nothing else, we can always hang the enemy who killed the glorious champion paladin, and raise the men's morale that way. The gods frown on executing prisoners without cause, Robert, the Grandmaster scolded him. It was an honorable combat, apparently. But no matter, men, take the 3th-century commander to the prepared wagon and make sure she is secure. We will speak later, Lady Eltarianal. So he does know my rank, Annuus mused as the soldiers pulled her along again. She went without a fight. The conversation had still left her feeling cold. It wasn't entirely unexpected, of course, but the reveal that she was to be a hostage to forced concessions sat ill with her. Privately, she doubted her own words just a little. Her mother had much influence, so their plan was, realistically, not entirely unlikely to gain some leverage. The question was how much. Not enough to surrender, certainly. Besides, this would be decided on the battlefield. The battle was still raging around them. The thunder of Imperial artillery shook the earth regularly. One shell exploded close enough to her to make one soldier of her escort flinch. They moved away from the battle proper, though, and stopped at a strange wooden cart with metal bars reinforcing the frame and with several heavy chains attached. The soldiers pushed her inside before they locked the door. Annuus took her last opportunity to look around and take in as many details as possible. She wondered whether they'd had this ready for prisoners or prepared it for her specifically. There was obviously magic in the frame of the vehicle to prevent her escape. At least they didn't start moving it. She sighed, then sat down on the bench inside the wagon. There were a few cracks between wooden boards, so at least it wasn't too dark to see. Standing up and craning her neck let her catch a glimpse of what was going on outside. Annuus considered the distance to the top, the lack of room inside the vehicle, then considered the guards outside. Trying to make a hole large enough to escape would be risky. For now, she focused on her shackles, twisting her hands and testing their give. The cuffs weren't enchanted. She started carefully scraping the solid metal of the shackles against the wooden boards making up the wagon. It didn't work, so she switched tactics, sat down and twisted her legs to use her metal boot buckles instead. They were sharp by design. And she only needed a few splinters. It was when she poked the first one into the keyhole of her shackles and carefully braced it that she heard a commotion start outside. Annuus froze for a moment, then kept working, making sure to be as quiet as possible. The guards around the wagon called something to each other. There were hurried footsteps. Something touched her mind, a brief contact from a familiar presence. Annuus inhaled deeply, and finally managed to open the shackles, quickly shaking them off and doing the same with the chains around her feet. Then she jumped up, wedging herself into the corner of the wagon, and peered outside. There were several pillars of smoke, not too far away from her. Someone had set a fire. A distraction? From the northeast, the sounds of battle had gotten louder. A moment later, there was a soft popping sound in her wagon and the light thrown onto the walls changed. She pressed herself against the wall, turned around and jumped down, landing softly. Ices Alturiel smiled at her. Ready to get out of here? Annuus had to resist the temptation to make some noise. Yes, please, she responded just as quietly. Can you teleport us? Or do you need to make a portal? There was some kind of screeching sound, and the noise outside redoubled. Ices frowned. It would need to be a portal, but, she gestured with her hands. Annuus could vaguely sense her mana, trying something, but nothing happened. Then she felt something else and shoved the older woman to the side, covering her with her body. The door of the wagon exploded inward, raining splinters of wood. Annuus ducked her head, but nothing hit her. Ices had put up a shield, she realized belatedly. The wagon tilted and Ices grabbed her arm. Annuus pulled her closer, catching her around the waist, and then jumped forward, twisting, pushing off the crumbling wall as the wagon was only barely turned over before it fell apart. She managed to stay on her feet as they landed outside, setting the old priestess down a bit less gently than she'd intended, but Ices seemed to be fine. A rain of arrows fell on them, and Annuus looked around for a weapon as they turned to face the enemy. The Grandmaster was coming their way with an escort of soldiers, and several other high-level men. There were several champions, at least. Well, I was planning to suggest that we were surprisingly close to their most important leadership, Annuus muttered. Yes, I gathered, Ices replied. Well, will you look at that? 2 captures for the price of 1. One of the Westerners shouted, pointing his sword at them to the jeers of a few others. The 2 of them backed away a few steps, and Annuis ducked briefly to pick up a sharp piece of wood, for lack of anything better. She glanced around quickly. They're blocking teleportation? Yes, and scrying, Ices answered. We'll need to kill their champions. She grimaced. At least Regina is helping? As if on cue, it might well have been, the soldiers behind them started fighting each other. They had been drawing closer, evidently to encircle them, but now several of their number had turned traitor, attacking the others wildly. 2 of the Grandmaster's own escort did the same. To the left, Regina told them tersely. The contact was short, with a light touch, as if she could spare no more focus on them than this. Still, they both went left without hesitation, ducking low. A moment later, a large ball of fire exploded where they'd just been, and a great lance of light followed up by sweeping to the right. Several arrows and other magic spells followed. She must have made a psychic illusion, Annuis realized. This only bought them a few moments, though. The Grandmaster was casting another barrage of light lances, sweeping outward in all directions, and some of them caught on Ice's shield, being diverted into other directions. The priestess was too busy to hide them, preparing a spell of her own. A moment later, she cast it, and the earth trembled. It took Annuis a moment to realize this was a secondary effect. Instead, some of the enemy fighters were pulled together, in the center of the group, and the rest had to visibly strain to resist a sudden pull. Even the Grandmaster lost his footing, sliding backward before he managed to push himself forward again. Then a second fold of space appeared, this one visible in the way it bent the light, and any enemy not fortunate enough to be outside the area of effect was suddenly deformed in hideous and unexpected ways. One of the champions was dead, she estimated. At least 4 were left, and she could hear Ices panting harshly. Annuis threw her improvised spear, but it bounced off the Grandmaster's breastplate, even if it stopped him in his tracks for a moment. Then he kept advancing, flanked by 3 other champions. A 4th stayed behind, shooting a string of arrows from a great bow. Annuis dived to the side, feeling icicles splash on her jacket. Ices cursed and stumbled, and she could see the blood blooming on her left shoulder. Annuis swallowed heavily, cursing her lack of weapons. We can't win like this. There's too many of them and we're trapped. 2 champions charged Ices, clearly considering her the bigger threat. She had to keep retreating, trying to dodge, but they were cutting her off from Annuis. Even a brief look showed Ices was struggling to do more than keep her space-warping shield active. Annuis grit her teeth and reached for her last skill, which was available to her again. It wouldn't be enough. But she grasped for the divine mana she could sense, trying to bend it to her will. Her pulse roared in her ears, and something thumped through her body that must have been simply her heartbeat but felt like the beat of the world around her. Time twisted and stumbled, and a new voice spoke into her head, in the rhythm of her heart and the steps around her and the light suddenly erupting from under her skin, where the divine mana in and around her writhed and seemed to multiply. Annuis Eltarianal, you have proved yourself beyond all doubt and you are a great hero already, but I need you to be a greater one for me. Will you accept? Lady Alienize, Annuis gasped, in her mind. The words had appeared in her head like they were whispered into her ear and shown in a system notification at the same time. She felt the touch of the goddess, beyond all doubt. You want to make me your champion? I can think of no one better. Why only me? Why now? She asked before she could stop herself. Why not before? This moment is a fulcrum that will turn the tide of this battle, and possibly the war, Alienize answered. As for your other question, perhaps I have waited too long. But I will not divide my power among many champions like my opponents do. I cannot match their quantity, so I must have stronger individuals. And by keeping it in reserve, you kept a trump card that could turn into a strategic victory, Annuis realized. Indeed. I knew you would be a good choice. I will not give up my own convictions, Annuis said after a moment of consideration. I am truly honored, but I am not certain that I can best represent your ideals, my lady. Surely there is more to this than the war. I do not know if my idea of progress is the right one. Yes, Alienize agreed. Annuus could faintly sense satisfaction from her. I think I need someone who will question me, who will push back. I have tried to be better, but old habits are hard to break, even for gods. You have already seen progress, in many ways. Across centuries. Unlike a human, an elf is more likely to understand the long view, I think. By all means, help Regina's enlightenment. Drag your city into your desired future kicking and screaming. Find your people's own way through what is coming. I have been told I do not believe in people even if they believe in me, but, I think, I can believe in you, to start. Annuus swallowed, feeling like her core was turning into molten heat. Then I accept, and thank you. It felt like her skin was stretched to make room inside it. As mana poured into her, the light she gave off increased, and 2 lances of light formed in her hands. At the same time, a system notification was transmitted directly to her brain. Congratulations, Annuus Eltarianal, you have become a champion of a god. Champions receive divine aspect mana directly from their patron and may direct it to work miracles along with boosting their own abilities. Prolonged exposure and training may unlock further abilities. As champion of Alien Eyes, goddess of progress, you will receive the following benefits. Boosted progression, your experience gain is increased by 50%. Champion skill, your abilities will be boosted and their cooldowns decreased. Your spells will cost less mana. Your non-system spells may also be enhanced with the aid of your patron's mana. Hero of progress, you may break past your normal limits to accomplish legendary feats. Your words and actions will inspire all allies who see you, boosting their own abilities, and you may even sway enemies to your side. This effect will strengthen if you fight in the name of making a better world and fade if you defend stagnation. There may be other effects manifesting in time. Note that excessively channeling divine mana may cause spiritual, mental, and physical injury. Annuus almost felt outside of her body as the notification faded, its words seared into her mind. Her right arm moved, and the lance it carried flew true, striking Grandmaster Seaborn directly in the throat. It cut through his gorget as if it was mere paper, and he fell. Annuus ran forward, pulling the divine mana still flowing freely through her to force it into the shape of several javelins even as she thrust her second lance at another enemy. He dodged, but then a barrage of magic missiles from Ices distracted him and she pushed him into the next attack from his fellow, so a fireball engulfed his head. Annuus turned. She had more champions to kill, and freshly empowered, feeling her new abilities wrap around her, it was a fight she knew she would win. And then they had a battle to win, as well, but they would. Chapter 429, Fronts and Allies. Regina hadn't expected things to turn out like this, but she wasn't about to complain. It had taken a lot of her mental energy to try and help Ices and Annuus. They were far away from her and even from any drones, and all of the minds around them were alert and in the grip of strong emotions. She had flexed her powers perhaps more than ever before by trying to grasp and manipulate some of these minds. In a way, it had been a great learning experience. Actually trying to take over or shove illusions into the brains of enemy soldiers during a battle was mostly a step beyond what she'd done so far, especially at this scale. But Regina also found it easier than perhaps it should have been. Madras was right, probably, she did have an innate talent for this sort of thing. It helped that the men she targeted were raging fanatics who hated everything the Empire represented, and sometimes hated elves on principle, too, so she didn't feel too bad about it. Even when she got many of the fighters killed by making them attack their fellows. In comparison, the psychic illusion, using one of her spells channeled remotely, was almost easier. It had at least kept her allies safe for a bit, even if Regina knew it wouldn't have held forever. And then, of course, things were taken out of her hands as Alien Eyes deigned to intervene. She'd been basically kicked out of Annuus' head as soon as the goddess started her choosing, or empowering the woman, or... Regina wasn't sure about the terminology. It was still very interesting to witness, even if she only got the beginning stages and then a vague impression from her own psychic senses and Ices distracted watching. She probably could have tried to hang on to a more direct connection to Annuus' mind, but it felt like that would have been a bad idea. At least now they'd decisively turned this confrontation around, and probably won the whole battle. Regina didn't even have to do anything, except metaphorically lean back and eat popcorn as Annuus dismantled the people sent against her. She felt almost high off the empowering, but her mind was also sharp and clear, and Annuus was clearly more powerful than anyone else present. Presumably, one of her new abilities was active right out of the gate. She killed her first champion and someone else Regina wasn't entirely sure about, possibly a champion, probably just high-leveled elite, without any of her weapons, then took a bow and arrows from another elite she killed and nailed the next champion's head to a piece of wagon with 3 arrows fired in a single breath. It only got worse for her enemies after that. Ices helped, of course. The two of them worked together easily, and the old priestess managed to prevent anyone from escaping. She herded them together for Annuus to snipe them. It's quite cool to see what she can do with a proper heavy hitter to back her up, Regina mused. Then they must have killed or destroyed whoever or whatever had kept the area locked down, and Ices teleported both of them to the hill where the general had retreated with his elite bodyguards. Annuus resummoned her lance of divine light. Ices unrolled another plane of distorted space that scythed through them, and they worked their way through the leadership of the enemy army. 2 more champions, or so Regina assumed, tried to stop them. One of them at least managed to get the elf duo to pause before he was killed. Then, with their strongest protectors dead, there was not much left to save the rest of the army brass. Granted, that might have been because a lot of the soldiers were already running. Witnessing enemy champions decimate their own champions and their leadership was clearly too much for them. Even the guards the general had tried to scramble to defend himself were clearly affected. Some of them just fled while others were clearly too terrified to fight effectively. Some tried their best, but were no match for their opponents. It got worse after Ices, following a nudge from Regina, teleported straight into the path of the fleeing general and cut off his head, only for Annuus to put it on another pike she'd liberated. It was grisly, of course, but Regina appreciated their skill at inspiring fear. She was still helping it along with her own efforts, using her psychic abilities to effectively spread a low-level aura of fear over the area, though it was hard to tell how effective it was exactly, under the circumstances. Regardless, their combined efforts bore fruit. They were still only 2 people in the middle of lots of enemy soldiers, but those men weren't thinking about it like that. And, of course, they weren't really alone. The other Elven, and allied, soldiers were getting closer, as they pushed forward from the city, taking the opportunity to strike deep into the enemy lines. After making sure Ices and Annuus were fine for now, Regina changed her approach and went for anyone who seemed like they were trying to rally the Westerner army. With their entire central leadership suddenly gone, the Westerner soldiers were effectively aimless, unable to act as a proper army, for now. Killing their leaders had disordered them, now she just needed to make sure they didn't reorganize. The battle was bloody and chaotic. Regina tried her best to make sure the various Elven and Imperial commanders were pointed in the right direction, but combined with her efforts at striking enemy leadership, either by directly attacking them, or, more often, directing Imperials to do it, she couldn't do much. However, the elves were good at this, anyway. They had a clear chain of command, a catalog of signals everyone knew, had battle plans prepared and also options to adjust them on the fly, and they were motivated to defend their homes. The coordination with the dwarves was sometimes a bit rough, but overall, it worked. After a few hours, Regina took a mental step back, exhaling heavily. She opened her eyes, stood, stretched, and gulped down 2 glasses of water. Her normal schedule for the day had been completely obliterated, and there were probably a few officials angry at her. Well, they could contain themselves, this was vitally important. Still, she did have other responsibilities as well, so Regina quickly checked on other areas of her empire through the psychic link and read through a few reports. The portal Ices had made still stood. The Westerners had scrambled some troops to attack at once, but it had clearly been simply whoever they'd had in the area gathered for a hasty strike, and the attack had been beaten back easily. Now the Empire had transferred enough troops, and they'd come far enough in building fortifications, that it would need a much bigger attack to threaten the site. And the reinforcements they'd sent had also helped take the pressure off the local Imperial forces. They'd re-established communication with Ada, even if it was still by messenger rather than by the psychic link directly, and they'd got updated information. Ben had adjusted their force distribution accordingly. Regina only looked far enough to be sure that they had things under control, but it didn't seem like something was on fire that she had to pay attention to right now. She was confident the senior drones would be able to handle it. Though she did make sure to read Lily's messages, as well, to keep up to date on other aspects of the situation. According to her, the city of Pezzeton was still a pressure cooker of anxiety, resentment and discontent, but at least some of the pressure had been let out. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Honor Sazator hadn't been seen again. Personally, Regina was more interested in Annuus right at the moment. She'd been expecting Alien Eyes to choose a few champions sooner or later, and had thought the goddess might have already done that, and that she simply hadn't heard of them, but Regina had to admit, she hadn't expected her. Which was probably her own fault. Annuus was a capable soldier and officer, she was politically connected in more than one way, she'd been part of the Southern Expedition, and she was just about the best pick if Alien Eyes wanted to choose an elf from Aridel without ruffling feathers in the Empire, or among Regina's inner circle. Now both Lion and Alien Eyes had chosen an elven champion. Regina had not heard of or seen any of the opposing gods making anyone but a human their champion, but they were probably constrained in their recruitment pool. Maybe they would if they could? Regardless, she made a mental note to consider the point in more depth later. There might be something philosophically important here, a point about diversity, if it wasn't just because they wanted agents with more experience. Regardless, it was with a bit of trepidation she'd rather not admit to that Regina contacted Annuus again psychically. "You don't need me to tell you this, but you did fantastically," she said. "Congratulations. I hope Alien Eyes is treating you well." "I can hardly complain so far, Empress Regina," Annuus responded with a bit of amusement. She was clearly exhausted, and lightly injured, but otherwise she seemed to be in good spirits. "But thank you. You'll be busy, so I won't take much of your time," Regina continued. "I just wanted to let you know that my door is always open, metaphorically speaking. I have to admit that I'm curious. If there is anything you need, don't hesitate to ask. And thank you for protecting Ices in the fight." "Of course," the elf said seriously. "She risked much to help me escape. I owe her. And thank you, too, Your Imperial Majesty. Your help was much appreciated." But Annuus didn't outright say that she owed her, too, Regina noted, feeling slightly amused. Clearly, Annuus was aware of the political implications of her words and was considerate of them. "Unsurprising. Anytime," she answered. Regina hadn't pushed too deeply, both because it would have been unethical and impolite, and because she didn't know if this bond, or whatever, came with psychic defenses, but even just connecting to Annuus' mind showed Regina a few things. It was similar to Ices, but a bit different, of course, just like Alien Eyes was different from Lion. In both cases, Ices and Annuus, their minds were still clearly their own. It supported the idea that any indoctrination enemy champions showed was just that, mundane indoctrination with propaganda, social pressure, or emotional manipulation. They weren't being directly controlled by the gods. There was clearly some kind of channel that gave the champions divine mana, but it only had a very faint trace in their psychic signature, probably more of a dim mirror image. It was also clear the gods would only know what champions were doing when they paid attention to them. Alien Eyes was not currently focused on Annuus, or at least, Regina was pretty sure of that. She let the conversation end there and moved on. Ices was also exhausted, and didn't manage to suppress it as well as Annuus did. Well, she was an old lady. Regina urged her to get some rest, tabling a few questions she had for later. The rest of her drones in the area were doing well, coordinating with each other and with the dwarves and elves to shore up their communications. The battle was winding down, more or less. Many Westerner soldiers were running. Chasing them down would require a lot of effort, too. After making sure nothing else was on fire, Regina withdrew from the psychic link and visited the bathroom. After adding a few more eggs to the nursery, well, technically her drone attendants carried them to the nursery, but still, she skipped the long bath she would have preferred to take for a quick shower, before she quickly scarfed down the meal a servant had brought up. Then it was time for one more meeting she wanted to have today. It was hardly the first time she'd had such a meeting with Ignis Allerin, to be fair, but it had been a while since the last one. And Regina hadn't heard anything from Madras, or Armin or another dark elf, in a while. She was curious if there was news. Unfortunately, the war is still raging, Iknes replied with a sad shake of her head. They were meeting in a private meeting room, mostly alone. Regina hardly thought the Dark Elf ambassador would try to knife her. There were still a few guards outside, and Ira was sitting with Regina, too. But have you heard from Madras? She asked. I've received a message from the border outposts, who've sent on reports of troop movements, Iknes said. No letter from my sister yet, since the last one I showed you, Your Majesty. But by now, she should have reached the Governance and Reform Council. They might have already clashed with the Loyalist army. Yes. It's frustrating to have to wait for information, Regina admitted. I can't imagine how it must be for you. Well, one does learn a little patience, in time, Iknes smiled, and Regina reminded herself that she was probably a few centuries old. But it's not easy to know my home is being fought over. Regina nodded cautiously. And yet you're here. Iknes sighed. Some of the courtly mask dropped as she let the tiredness and resignation she felt peek through. I've thought it's the best I could do for my people, but I must admit, I have started to reconsider that, she said. Perhaps I could be of help. I have considered leaving. I'd be sorry to see you go, but I would understand, Regina said. I also hope you understand that given the current situation and the ongoing war, I can't send troops to the Eternal Dark, no matter how much I sympathize. That is understood, naturally, Iknes said. Regina knew that she was still a bit disappointed and would have liked for the Empire to offer more, but Iknes was also enough of a realist that she didn't really expect it. Regina still suspected that the Western Confederation and Esseman had deliberately instigated this civil war to keep the Dark Elves from intervening in their own war. Iknes had probably had the same thought. Neither of them could do much about it right now, though. The move seemed to have succeeded, as galling as it was. But if the tide were to turn against the reformists in the Eternal Dark, Regina would have to put more thought into what she would be willing to give them. The Empire didn't exactly have a lot to spare, but in such a case, she would send troops to assist them. For the rest of the meeting, Iknes subtly steered the conversation to more technical matters and dropped some hints about the technical help the Empire could give her side of the war. Regina didn't mind, it was to be expected. Obviously, trying to squeeze help out of her was why Iknes thought she could help her people by being here. She didn't make any promises, though. It was easy to agree to something while speaking privately with someone she liked, but that didn't make it the best choice strategically. Although they were already putting together some schematics and educational materials, and maybe they could throw in some defunct or outdated tech as samples. If nothing else, the recent battle had reminded Regina of the value of having allies. Chapter 430, Reunion. The city of New Amberg had changed a lot in the time she'd been gone, Janice mused. Overall, she really hadn't been gone that long. Of course, most of that time had been when she'd been leading the campaign to the north. She pushed away thoughts of that, however, she'd already recognized that dwelling on it was not productive. And neither Ben nor Max appreciated comments about how, with the new portal, she could go visit and check in with Ada and the others personally. At least Ada had done well with the army. It burned a little that it was no longer her army, but Janice had gotten used to it. And to be fair, there was still a lot of work she could do here. Arguably more important work than preparing operations another general could handle just as well. She knew Regina would have preferred her to remain in a more secure location for a little longer, but Janice had put her foot down. Given recent events, she needed to be here. And she would be benefiting from the security measures of the Empire's heart, including those for Regina herself, so it really wasn't any more dangerous than staying somewhere else. Her arrival at the city was relatively unremarkable. They had elected not to make it public in advance, also for security reasons and because she would rather not make a fuss, so Janice's convoy managed to pass through the streets relatively quickly and with little notice. They still drew some looks, since several soldiers of the Star Guard were visibly escorting it, but that, too, wasn't all that unusual. Groups of soldiers, usually mixed ones, were probably a pretty regular sight here. It did offer Janice the opportunity to look around, even if she had to do it through the windows of a wagon. The city had grown, but more than that, it was starting to feel more lived in. Even in the central part, there was still a lot of construction going on. The buildings obviously all looked new, but people had customized them and most of the streets were a riot of color. There weren't just plants and murals and cloth hangings, but also street stalls doing business and people hanging around in outdoor eateries and tea houses. And while the trees planted in the wide cross boulevards were still small, they'd grown a bit. Or so she imagined. But her escort moved on and they quickly passed out of the ordinary streets of the city, the government buildings in the center looming ahead of her. The imperial palace had gotten some work done, and someone had painted religious symbols on the walls of a side wing, which several people were currently trying to scrub off. Janice smiled a little at the sight. At least there were few symbols of the gods, and more that she vaguely recognized belonging to folk religion and what was now popular: a cross, a stylized insect wing, a bad rendering of a light bulb. Whoever painted this had been indiscriminate. Janice also noted with some amusement that the gardens had clearly seen some magic used to make all the plants grow and make the trees look like they'd been here for years. The driver guided the wagon into a covered bay within a courtyard, and Janice waited a few seconds for her guards to secure the area before she hopped out. She glanced around, noting Jay and a few others were nearby as well, waiting for her. Then she nodded at the driver and soldiers and turned to leave. At least she was fit enough to be seen in public. She didn't look ill or injured, she could walk properly and wouldn't give people cause to worry about her health. Such thoughts fled her mind when Janice finally passed through the doors, a side entrance to the building complex, and finally met her friends and siblings she hadn't seen in too long face to face. Regina stepped forward first, her mind shining with love and welcome, and after a tentative mental question, she embraced her. Janice exhaled and tightened her grip on the sister of her heart for a moment. She felt safe, truly safe for possibly the first time in months. Somehow, it suddenly brought everything that had happened back. I almost died. Regina let go, but continued the mental equivalent of a hug, wrapping her in love and reassurance. Janice smiled at her, returning the feelings. She knew Regina wasn't usually an emotionally demonstrative person, with things like hugs, especially not in public, so she appreciated it. I almost lost you, Regina said. They were so closely connected right now it was easy to pick up on each other's feelings and trains of thought. You almost died far away in a campaign I sent you on. But I didn't, and I'm back safe and sound, Janice said reassuringly. Then Regina stepped aside and Max replaced her, wrapping Janice in a quick embrace. After that, it felt like she was passed through several more drones. Their emotions mirrored Regina's and she sent her own appreciation and reassurance back. And then she stood in front of the other person present whose emotions she couldn't sense, well, except faintly through an echo of the psychic link, probably leaked deliberately by Regina. Kiera smiled as well, but hesitated for a moment, her arms half-raised awkwardly. Janice stepped forward, embracing her tightly. I missed you, Kiera said, slightly muffled since she was speaking into Janice's jacket. Janice smiled and touched her cheek to hers. Me too. I love you, she added. I love you too. Then Kiera loosened the hug and glanced around. Janice tried not to mind. But there was no one else outside the psychic link around, just other drones, well, and Galatea. So Janice kissed her. At least when they finally stepped back, Kiera was smiling brightly again. But please don't do something like that again, she added. I think you took 10 years off my lifespan. Janice grinned and resisted the urge to make a joke about short-lived humans. This wasn't the time or place. I promise I won't, she said instead. Not that she could really promise not to get cursed again, but it was what both of them needed to hear right now. Then she was distracted by greeting Galatea, and then a few other people as they moved through the corridors. But finally, they stopped outside her quarters. Regina shooed the other drones off, giving Janice a reassuring look and a reminder they would have dinner together later. Then she courteously left Janice and Kiera alone. Kiera kissed her again as soon as the door to her bedroom snapped shut behind Janice. She smiled into the kiss, tangling a hand in her girlfriend's hair. Their kiss picked up a bit of speed until they were both panting slightly when they broke apart. How are you, really? Kiera asked. I read your letter, but I'd like to hear it from you. Janice sighed, her mood spoilt slightly. But it was only fair. She sat down on the chair beside the bed. I'm not fully recovered, truly, she said seriously. At least not, well, magically. I still feel weaker physically, but that's passing. My mana feels thinner and I have more trouble with control. I won't be able to seriously fight for a while. Kiera frowned. She sat down on the bed, then scooted closer. I'm almost a bit relieved to hear that, she admitted after a moment. That you won't be fighting, I mean. Not that you're having trouble with your magic. I know, Janice said. I meant my promise, I'll make sure to be careful. But I can't just sit here, either. The Empire needs me. We need you too, and you don't need to risk your life, Kiera pointed out. You're the crown princess, not a soldier, it's perfectly reasonable to prioritize your safety. I know, but, she sighed. I can't help thinking, what sort of crown princess am I if I can't even contribute to the nation fighting for its life? Besides, you've been wanting to go and fight too, since before the war started. Kiera smiled slightly, but it turned into a grimace. Well, allow me a bit of hypocrisy. I'm just concerned about you. Given your propensity for reckless decisions. Reckless decisions? Janice frowned. Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. Just, with you being targeted like that, you need to be careful. Of course, but we can't control everything, Janice pointed out. There were assassination attempts in the Cernlian Palace too. And it's not like I went out and tried to get cursed. Enemy action happens. Didn't you? Kiera grimaced, crossing her arms. You set up that diplomatic meeting. You met them face to face even when you realized that Sazator lady was present. We were meeting in my own camp surrounded by soldiers, Janice protested. She suddenly felt a bit nauseous again, although that was probably psychosomatic. She didn't like to be reminded of what happened or to think that she might have been responsible for it. If they tried to attack me, they wouldn't have gotten far. I wouldn't have eaten or drunk anything or even touched them. We even had mages ready to purify the air. Excuse me if I didn't know a curse like this was possible. And considering it apparently took the divine magic of two separate gods to make this possible. Two gods? Kiera interrupted, frowning. It seems like it. Janice sighed, slouching further in her chair. Then she took a deep breath and began to recount her conversations with Ices and the dream, or vision, she had experienced. At least speaking about it helped her to clear her mind and calm down. Kiera went quiet, and the silence lingered for a minute after Janice finished. I don't like this, she finally said. I really don't like this at all. Fighting the gods was bad enough, but now they have soul magic from some ancient other-dimensional mages? What am I even supposed to do about something like that? And this vision? It would have been nice to know you had some kind of psychic ancestry, apparently. Yes, for me too, Janice said drily. But I don't think that's quite it. And at least we don't have to do it alone. Kiera gave her a complicated look Janice found hard to parse. I suppose, she finally said. I am grateful to the goddess for healing you. But actually, I think it cost Lion more power than she was willing to admit, Janice said. But I get where you're coming from. If our enemies can do something like this again, it's a concern. At least Ices and Galatea are looking into soul magic. I suppose that is something, Kiera agreed, shaking her head slightly. If only I had the time to join them, I just might. Me too, Janice agreed. She sighed. Well, given my current condition, I might just blow something up by accident. It's really frustrating. There's this fascinating area of magic, and I might not get to learn anything even though I'm here. Kiera grinned, leaning closer to poke her forehead slightly. Never change, Janice. Although I would say dangerous rather than fascinating. It can be both. I suppose I haven't even completed basic studies in teleportation magic yet, though. But I think I will learn at least the theory while I have the chance. I am not certain how much free time we will have. Kiera's expression darkened. Given this absolutely foolish conspiracy against the imperial government. Janice's own mood darkened at the reminder. She nodded sharply. Rest assured, I will do all I can to deal with that matter. The last thing we need right now is internal unrest. Those treasonous nobles are playing right into our enemies' hands, probably on purpose, I guess. Well, their plans can go hang. Hopefully literally and soon. I'd like to see that. Kiara blinked slightly. Maybe it was the vehemence in her words. That sounds a little bloodthirsty for you. Why? Janice scoffed. I didn't mean summary execution. Obviously there should still be proper trials. Only those people actually involved should be hung. Or something else, I guess. It doesn't have to be hanging. Still a little bloodthirsty, Kiara commented. Janice shifted on her seat. You have presided over death sentences before, haven't you, Kiara? I mean, nowadays it should be done by the imperial courts, but before? Kiara looked down, her forehead creasing in a way Janice found rather cute. Yes, of course, the courts. But yes, I have. Janice cocked her head. It sounded like Kiara wasn't entirely happy about the current situation. But she decided not to press that point right now. Then I don't see the issue. Treason should be punished, but it won't be up to me, anyway. Kiara sighed. I just don't want to see people arrested and executed just for voicing some discontent with the empire. Many have lost out on privileges or political relevance, even if they may have gained other things in exchange. It's to be expected that they would be unhappy. I can even sympathize. Janice stared at her for a moment, clamping down on the first response on the tip of her tongue. Why does this bother me? It's not like she's wrong, really, is it? Maybe it was something about the way Kiara phrased it or the way she spoke. Well, I don't sympathize, Janice said, still a little sharper than she'd intended to. The people I'm talking about, they've done more than be unhappy. I don't propose going after every knight who's grumbled about a new ministry. I meant the people actively conspiring against Regina, against us. Maybe you should have a little more faith in our law enforcement apparatus? They won't start any unnecessary crackdowns. We'll be watching closely. Is it so easy for you? Kiara muttered quietly. Then more loudly, I know, I suppose I'm just antsy regarding the entire situation. Are we still talking about unhappy nobles? Janice wondered for a moment, before she pushed the thought aside. She pinched the bridge of her nose, closing her eyes for a moment. No, I think maybe I came on too strongly, she said. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to snap at you or to dismiss your concerns. That's fine, you didn't. Kiara smiled, reaching out to grasp her hand. Janice squeezed hers slightly. I guess it's a bit of a sore point for me right now, she admitted. When I was in the Western Confederation, I really realized how screwed up the entire system is. I mean, I knew that before, but it was still somehow different. They still have lots of unfree peasants, and it felt like everything was still stuck, like people were living closer to the edge, I suppose. And, well, the nobles I met weren't exactly endearing. I mean, we were at war, obviously things would be like this. But still. Kiara nodded. I understand, but remember you're in the Empire now. Things are different here. Yes, of course, Janice murmured. She got up and dropped down on the bed beside Kiara. She didn't voice the questions in the back of her mind, like, do you really understand? Or, how different is it, really? That would be unworthy, and unfair to Kiara. And I need a little more time to reflect on all of this first, I think. Instead, Janice pushed away these thoughts and kissed her lover. This was not the time for philosophy, but to enjoy their reunion. It was wonderful to be back.